Hello, welcome to the Monday, May 1st, 2023 meeting of the Wayzata Planning Commission. I hereby call the meeting to order. My name is Larissa Stockton, and I'm the chair of the Planning Commission. I have just a few words about how to participate in this evening's meeting. The hybrid meeting information is as follows. To join Zoom meeting, use meeting ID 881-7178-5925, passcode 481476. Members of the public may attend this Planning Commission meeting in person or watch and listen remotely by viewing the meeting on Channel 8 WCTV and at the city's website at wayzata.org/WCTV. Public comment during the public forum and/or public hearing portions of the meeting may be provided in person at the meeting in advance or by logging into the Zoom call and raising your hand during the public hearing. When your name is called in the meeting, you'll be seen and heard in our council chambers and the cable channel. You'll be then asked to unmute, and then you may begin your comment. All public comments must include your full name and your address. Next, we'll take the roll call. Director Gellner, please take the roll.
Yes, Chair. Commissioner Schwalbe. Commissioner Sorensen.
Here.
Commissioner Douglas.
Here.
Chair Stockton.
Here.
Commissioner Merriam.
Here.
Commissioner Severson.
Here.
And Commissioner Elg.
Here.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have the approval of the agenda. Does anybody have any questions or proposed changes to tonight's agenda? Okay, hearing none, may I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Thank you, Commissioner Merriam. May I have a second?
Second.
Oops, a tie.
Oh.
Go with Severson. Thank you, Commissioner Severson. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed? The ayes have it. The motion passes, and the agenda is approved. Next on the agenda is the consent agenda. The consent agenda consists of the following 4 items: the approval of meeting minutes on April 17th, 2023, approval of Planning Commission report and recommendation of approval for design deviations for rooftop mechanical equipment at 900 Wayzata Boulevard East, approval of Planning Commission report and recommendations of approval for zoning text amendments to Chapter 936 Tree Preservation Ordinance and Chapter 918 Fencing Screening. And finally, D, approval of the Planning Commission report and recommendation of approval for conditional use permits for municipal solar at 600 Rice Street East and 747 Mill Street East. Does any commissioner have any questions or comments on any item from the consent agenda? May I have a motion to approve the consent agenda as presented?
So moved, Douglas.
Thank you, Commissioner Douglas. Can I get a second?
Second, Schwalbe.
Thank you, Commissioner Schwalbe. Further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The motion passes, and the consent agenda is approved. Okay, great. Next, we're on to the public hearing. This evening, we have one item on the public hearing. The item is to consider the development application for rezoning CUPs for parking and first floor residential, shoreland PUD CUP, shoreland impact plan / CUP, and design review at 200 Lake Street East. Community Director, Development Director Gellner, would you please walk us through?
Yes, I will begin the presentation, and planning consultant Eric Swaber will also assist with the presentation this evening.
Perfect, thank you.
So you've already listed off the applications that are before us this evening. The applicant and owner is Lake West Development, LLC. The property is zoned for planned unit development, located here in yellow on the screen. And the property is guided for Central Business District, shown in purple here on the screen. We've highlighted the site here with the property lines outlined in red. Property is located along Lake Street with the railroad, BNSF Railroad, on the south side of the lot. This image is facing south towards the lake. We have Wayzata Beach and the Boatworks property to the south, as well as the historic depot to the east. Then on the north side, we have a number of redevelopments that have occurred in the last several years, including Wayzata Blue condominiums, Ventana Apartments, Melvin's 235 office building, and Meyer Place. That's a residential building. Ferndale's Road South is located on the west side of this property. This is an image of the existing building. This is the former TCF headquarters location. Now we've summarized the applications here. We'll also go into all of these in detail as well. Note the same order is used throughout this presentation as well as in the application materials, and will help guide the discussion as well tonight. I think what I'd like to do is not run through this list in detail right now, since we will be running through it momentarily. Instead, I'd like to turn over to Eric Swaber to describe the summary of the proposal, and then we'll move through each request and describe each request, and that'll allow us to really elaborate on the plan. And then, Chair, when we're finished with our presentation, the applicant has also prepared a number of materials to present to you.
Thank you, Chair and Planning Commission. What's shown here is the site plan, and then the first, or the ground level plan. You can see at the top, the areas in white are the 6 cores as we move from east to west it is cores A1, A2, A3, A4, A5, and A6 is the one on the farthest west. Again, we're showing the ground level plan. You could see in core A1, there's a little area in blue on the west, and then you see an open area, which we'll discuss further when we get into our descriptions. Core A2, A3, and A4 would have office uses completely on the first floor. And then you see cores 5 and 6 are split where there are office uses on the front half, the north half of the building, and then 3 apartments each on the first floor. We'll go into the other floors as we go further, but kind of understand the mix as it goes from east to west. The next slide is renderings. Here are both core A1, so the eastern portion of the building. You will notice on the bottom one, the access drive that goes down into the parking for the facility. We'll discuss that in more detail as we move on. Top slide, you see more from sidewalk level. You see the amount of windows and the cupola dome at the end. As we move more towards the middle of the site, you'll see that it has more pediments. The lower level has an area that is extended out from the building to provide that articulation. You can see the top levels, the residential have their own decks. These are the elevations of all the buildings. So starting at the top left, that's core A1, and then you see moving core A2, A3, A4, A5, and A6. You do see core A1 has that difference of the dome on the east-hand side. From there are rhythmic elements through at least core A2, 3, and 4. You can see there's a main entrance in the middle, surrounded by 2 pedimented areas that are closest to the street. You see on, it's barely visible, but on the east and west side, there's also a secondary door. So there are actually 3 doors, on this facade, but you see the middle door is the one that really is intensified. You'll also note on these 4 cores, there are the dormers in the roofs, and that's to allow the mezzanine, which we'll discuss further as we move on. Core A5 and A6 have many of the same elements, but you'll see core 5 has 3 bold doors. Core A4 only has the 1 central door. It's missing those dormers, and we'll discuss that when we get into building height, how the facades themselves are shrinking. It's the tallest facade to the east in core A1, and it's the shortest facade in core A6 as we move to the west. So regarding density, this development, we're showing both the ground level and the second level. You see the pink in the second level is all residential. Excuse me. Residences on the second or third floor in our downtown districts, the C4, C4A, C4B, are permitted uses. Residences on the first ground floor are conditional uses, and we'll go over those into more detail. But to get the 30 units, we're looking at both the second level for all 6 cores, and then the 8 additional units in core A5 and A6. So it's a 30 dwelling unit building with a little over 39,000 square feet of office use. The overall density would be 21.28 units per acre, so that is on the lower end, but it fits between the range of 20 to 30 units per acre. Open space, both our code and the way that the applicant intends to use this open space vary, so please bear with me with the different types of colors. But the yellow is mostly grassed areas, both the park on the east and then this little bit of a pocket open space on the west. The areas in blue, or the lightest blue, are the open space that's available to the public, with the exception of if the landlord was hosting some sort of special event, that could be used. The areas that are kind of in purple towards the south, the back of cores A1, A2, A3, and A4 are private open space for the use of the commercial businesses. And then you'll see for core 5, A5, and A6, the pink color are private open spaces for the use of the residences. And then you see for the upper level units, there is private open space, private outdoor open space through their decks and patios. So when this totals up, this is how we calculate the amount of open space required. They do meet the various standards that are called out within the code, including that there is a requirement for 500 square feet of usable open space for every unit. And the red or pink box shows how they would supply that amount of space. So this is the East Mini Park, how they're showing to install various plants and hardscape to provide areas to recreate and stop as you go from the Panaway to the east into this development. This is the green space on the west. Now we're going to move into a couple of the sections that relate to the code, but before we're actually getting into the request. The first one is building height. So as I stated before, the facades, different levels of exposure as you move from the east to the west. So the bottom facade is actually core A1, the one on the farthest east. Core A6 is on the top, the one that is on the farthest west. So we have an average grade plane that we need to determine the building height. And so the Lake Street is lower towards Berry and it's higher towards Ferndale. So you could see for core A1, the average grade plane is actually about 6 feet above the sidewalk in front of core A1. You could see in core A6, the average grade plane is actually about 5 feet lower than the sidewalk in front of core A6. And then we measure the height at the midpoint of the peak of the roof. And so the maximum building height would be 2 stories and 30 feet. And by the code definition, these buildings all are less than 30 feet in height. One other thing I'll point out, which we'll get into more detail here in a second, is how the mezzanines come into play. Here we go. So before we get into the mezzanines, these are cores A6 and A1, again showing, actually I have them labeled backwards, I apologize. Core A1 is to the left, core A6 is to the right, but again, the yellow is the average grade plane. So again, you'll see core A1, which again is to the left. When you're looking at the Lake Street sidewalk, the average grade plane is going 6 feet through that commercial use that fronts Lake Street. And then core A6, you see that average grade plane is going through the parking area because again, Lake Street is lower to the east and higher to the west. And then the red line again is where we'd measure for the height. So the building height is the distance between the yellow line and the red line. That's how the city code defines building height. Again, some of the cores A1, A2, A3, and part of A4 have the use of mezzanines, and they are highlighted here in green. This is an example of a build-out and how a mezzanine could work, but by building code, a mezzanine is not a floor or not a story, so mezzanines don't count. But the other requirement is a mezzanine cannot be any more than 30% of the room that the mezzanine's located in. So just to clarify, not 30% of the total unit size, 30% of any room that the mezzanine is located. So that's why you see in that building, the only part that would be a mezzanine is those green boxes. So now we're getting to what are the requests tonight. The first one is to rezone from PUD to C4A. You can see the lots directly to the north are both C4A in the middle, and then you see PUD for the more recent developments to the north. So this is the zoning district that best matches the comprehensive plan guiding of Central Business District, C4A. So a couple of questions to consider when we consider this rezoning is this request in compliance with the policies of the comprehensive plan? Does it conform with the present and future uses of the area? Does it conform with all of the performance standards? And a couple of them highlighted there are parking and loading, but you do see that list is noise and et cetera. So it needs to conform with all the other elements of the code. Does it have a negative effect on the area? Is it capable to serve the traffic generated? Does it emphasize specialty shops and office uses? Are the business establishments accessible from the exterior of the building? Does it contain retail service and residential and office uses? And does it exceed 2 stories or 30 feet? So moving on to the next request, this is a CUP for joint uses of a common 142 stall parking facility. So to go over this into a little bit of detail, this column to the left, that would be the parking requirement looking at the individual uses. The 30 residential units require 60 parking stalls on their own. The office uses would require, with any fraction you're to round up, would require 106 parking stalls. So if they weren't applying for this joint facility, we would be looking for 166 parking stalls. Looking at the joint facility, we look at 6 different times over the week. So during weekdays, we look at basically overnight from midnight to 7 a.m. We look during the peak of the day, 7 a.m. to 6 p.m., and then we look at evening, 6 p.m. to midnight. And then on weekends, we look at the same categories. If whichever one's the peak is what we'd look at, and in this case, the total requirement would be 142 parking stalls required for all of the commercial space being used for office and the 30 individual residences. They are providing 142 stalls. As we talked about in our staff report, this is looking at solely one use, one commercial use, office only. We did take a look at if all these spaces were used as retail, that would generate a need for 151 stalls. But because of the way this table works out, the peaks for office and commercial, or office and retail, are different. You'll see the peak for the retail happens more on the weekends, that if they had a mix of office and retail, that likely could be accommodated within 142 stalls. Restaurants, I don't see how restaurants would be able to work with this kind of a parking arrangement. Restaurants just have a much higher parking demand, and as you see, they are providing the absolute minimum for a joint facility. The other thing I'd point out is You'll see in that column of 7 a.m. to 8 or 6 p.m. during the weekday, the parking demand for the multifamily residential is only 36 stalls. So that's 60% of the stalls required if it was on its own. That means the residential stalls for these condominiums need to be available for the office users. So there can't be reserved parking stalls for the condominiums and have this joint facility CUP work. And then additionally, we have the loading and deliveries, which happen on the east side of the site. You will see there is one large loading and unloading area, which would allow for more of a semi or box truck type of delivery. There is a smaller loading area just to the west of Core A1. That would be for more like your Amazon van type of delivery. And then there's the trash and recycling that those types of vehicles would have to come in to pick up the trash and recycling. So questions to consider when we're looking at the joint parking facility use or conditional use permit: is it compatible with the present and future uses? Does it conform with all the performance standards, including parking and loading? Does the traffic generated exceed the capacity of the surrounding streets? So looking at the third request, we have a conditional use permit for multiple family dwellings on the first floor. Again, there are 8. There are 4 each in Core A5 and Core A6. The standards for those are they can't be located, they can't have more than 50% of the first floor footprint, and they shouldn't be located on the front half of the building. So those standards influence their design. You will see in the bottom, those are the south elevations. Because of the way the railroad tracks come through there, you will see that particularly on Core A5, there is a bit of a wall separating the railroad track and the units themselves. But that it would be the south elevation, which would be facing those railroad tracks and the homes to the south. So questions to consider for the ground floor, multiple family residential: is it compatible with the present and future uses? Does it conform with all the performance standards such as parking and loading? Can it be accommodated, the traffic that's generated? Ensure that they do not front or border Lake Street. Do they have a conflict with the existing or potential future commercial? Is the density standards of R5 met? And is the open space and recreational space provided? For the next request, we have the PUD CUP for the 30 residential condo units within the Shoreland District. So you'll see a table on the left, and then your central business district density on the right. What we have is that you are allowed to have between 20 and 30 units, and what we discussed before, it's a little over 21. But you draw tiers as you move out from the lake. The red line, which is the marina, that is the Lake Minnetonka in this case. You'll see the purple line would be tier 1, the orange line would be tier 2, and then the blue line is the outside boundary of tier 3. You are allowed by code to transfer density to a tier further from the lake, but you're not allowed to move density from a further tier closer to the lake. So looking at it, tiers, the first tier and the second tier are below the 20 units per acre, and it's moved density to tier 3. So it complies with the code. The intent of this portion of the Shoreland District is to have less density closer to the lake and allow it to transfer to more density further from the lake. So the questions to consider when looking at the residential PUD CUP: Does it have a negative effect on the health, safety, and welfare of the residents? Is it consistent with the comprehensive plan? Is the open space landlord or property or association controlled? Is there no density variation? No deviation from the height standards? Is the open space in perpetuity? And will at least 30% of the total development area be preserved by open spaces? And then finally, is the open space on land covered by roads, parking areas, or structures? The next request is the Shoreland Impact Plan conditional use permit for impervious surfaces coverages of 84.5%. The table on so the area in gray shown on the image on the top is the impervious surfaces proposed by the applicant. You'll see the table in the bottom. The existing impervious surface for the former TCF site is 74.4%. The proposal is 84.7%. So essentially increasing the impervious surface by 10% over the existing to the proposed. So the questions to consider when looking at the shore impact plan conditional use permit: does the development address and mitigate adverse impacts of the impervious surface? Does the design of the building minimize the appearance and blend the structures into the shoreland and vegetation? And then finally, the question to consider is the lot coverage less than 75%? Now, what I point out here is this is lot coverage, not impervious surface less than 75%. Lot coverage is the building, not all the impervious surfaces. So the lot coverage is less than 75%. The impervious surface is greater than 75%. So just want to point out this is a standard, a finding we need to make it clear that the finding is lot coverage, not impervious surface. So now we're moving into the two design deviations. The first design deviation is this massing break between A1 and A2. All the other massing breaks either are at sidewalk level or have a ramp that you can get up to the massing break. This particular one has this staircase and it's over 6 feet in height. The application requirements require images at eye level. That's the image to the left. The code is to provide a massing break that could provide views of Lake Minnetonka. The applicant has provided the graphic and the photograph on the right-hand side showing that without, or what they're trying to illustrate here is without, in the current condition, without anything happening, there is not a view of Lake Minnetonka from that existing location. So the questions are, well, sorry, a couple other, showing a couple of the other massing breaks. These are other massing breaks that are at lake level. You could see from the behind the view views that they have. The massing break requirements are that there's a 25-foot break for every 150 feet of facade. Cores A1, A2, A3, A4, and A5 are all 150 feet in length. They all contain massing breaks that are 25 foot wide. The massing break between A5 and A6 on the far west side, that is 25 feet massing break, but you'll see the facade itself is about 111, 112 feet. Just happens to be, as the property goes, they couldn't fit the full 150 feet in that location. So questions to consider: does it provide views of Lake Minnetonka? Does it provide greater, by granting this deviation, does it provide greater conformity with the other design standards or zoning ordinance standards? Does this deviation alleviate an undue burden? Does this massing break deviation have a positive effect on the area? So the last request is a design deviation for a parking structure that does not have an office use with a depth of 30 feet. So the box in red is the parking structure. You could see from the view on the left, the commercial space is only 12 feet 11 inches in depth. It doesn't have the 30-foot in depth that the design standards require. The view to the on the right-hand side, that shows at the ground what is, what are the uses. There are a couple office uses, then the entrance to the residences. One of the other parts of the design standard is at ground level, the parking structure, or at the ground, does the parking structure be located 40 feet from the Lake Street right-of-way? Not Lake Street, but Lake Street right-of-way. And I point that out because we have the regional trail in this location, and the regional trail is located within the Lake Street right-of-way. So it's not measuring from the curb to the parking structure, it's measuring from the right-of-way to the parking structure. So a couple things to consider when looking at the parking structure deviation. Is the deviation for the parking structure warranted for this use? Is the 80% retail usage extending to a depth of at least 30 feet? Is the parking structure located 40 feet from Lake Street right-of-way at ground level? Does the parking structure deviation provide greater conformity with the other design standards or zoning ordinance standards? Does the deviation alleviate an undue burden? Does the deviation have a positive effect on the area? A couple other items to consider before we open it up for questions. There is tree preservation that has been provided. The top shows the trees that are going to be removed. The bottom shows the trees that are going to be added. What ends up happening is, to meet the code requirement, they would need to provide fee in lieu of tree replacement for 79.8 inches. So not only would they need to plant the trees shown, they would also need to provide a fee in lieu. The city engineer has reviewed these plans, had a couple of comments. First, they did do a study, not only of this proposed development, but the proposal for 201 Lake Street that we reviewed, the PUD concept plan earlier this year. If both of those are approved, the existing sewer and water is adequate to serve both developments. The tree preservation plan provides for fee in lieu, but they state it could be either in fee in lieu or planting of trees in city parks. There is a Metropolitan Council Environmental Services sewer easement on the east side of the site that would need approval before those trees would be planted. The traffic study does show that there would not be an impact on the surrounding road network with the proposed development. The city engineer does recommend that as a specific condition, should this move forward, that parking and loading of delivery vehicles would be prohibited within the Lake Street right-of-way. So to describe the public review process, there were letters sent out by the city to everybody within 750 feet on April 20th. The public hearing notice was published in the Sun Sailor on April 20th, and the developer had a neighborhood meeting on April 24th. At the time of the Planning Commission, there were no public comments received, so they were not in your packet, but there were 6 provided at your desk today. 1 comment was in support. 5 comments noted opposition or concern, including the items that we list there: parking, scale, density, massing breaks, height, traffic uses, loading, rezoning, and the current PUD contract. The neighborhood meeting, this is the summary that the applicant has provided us. There were 23 people in attendance, and the topics that were discussed included access to Lake Street and vehicle parking, traffic impacts, delivery vehicles, shading of sidewalks, maintenance during ice and snow, railroads, reaction to the plans, public accessible spaces, and stormwater management and treatment. So after your conducting of a public hearing and your discussion around the request of the application, the Planning Commission should direct staff to prepare a draft Planning Commission report and recommendation with appropriate findings, reflecting a recommendation on the application for review and adoption at the next Planning Commission meeting. So with that, Emily and I would stand for any questions that you have.
Thank you, Planner Swaber. Do we have any clarifying questions of staff?
I have a question, if I may. Eric, can I please see the slide again about the open space calculations?
Yes.
And let me know again, 30% of the development is to be open space into perpetuity?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so you show the open space at grade, and some of those spaces are duplicated on the upper level? Is that
Right.
correct?
But it is possible that a person could be standing on the lower level space and the upper level space at the same time. But it is correct.
Right, but how do you do the calculation then? You add all these open spaces together and divide it by the size of the land?
For residences, you need 500 square feet per residence. So that's 15,000 square feet. They're providing, if you look at the private usable open space and the common shared open space, they're providing about 24,000 square feet of open space just in those two areas. So the red pinkish color and the yellow color would accommodate the open space required for the residences. There are a number of other open space requirements, such as for the residential PUD, CUP, but this calculation, if I recall correctly, it's about 50% of the site is open space as defined by the city code.
But how do you get the 50%? Do you divide the amount of open space over the size of the land?
Correct.
So you're adding all the pink spaces to all the main level. So is that just the way you do it? Because that doesn't make sense to me. You've got one piece of land, and if you've got open space on two different levels, it's not really.
When we're looking at the space available for the residences, we look at all the spaces available, whether it's on the ground level or the upper level. So, if there was a third level, we would look at if there was open space on the third level.
Okay, so, and then what's the 30%? Is that,
30% is the requirement of open space for the residential PUD/CUP. So within the shoreline district, you need to have 30% open space.
and how did you calculate the 30%? Did you use just the open space at grade level, or did you add the upper level space?
We added it all together. Yep.
Okay.
So what is the actual percentage then of open space? It's probably on here somewhere, but I'm not seeing it.
In the staff report, I need to look at which page it's on. page 60 of page 203. It is 45,516 square feet, which I guess is closer to 45, 46%. I'd have to do the division. But you see on the table in that same page, it lists out the percentages.
But they have more than met the requirement then, is that right?
Yeah, so including the balconies, it's 50,539 square feet, which is 51.07% of the site.
Okay, thank you.
All right, well, it does look like if you only included the open space at ground level, you'd still have 30%, but I don't, the math of using the upper level doesn't make sense to me. And then I was wondering about the retail, the parking chart, and you had said, you had talked about if it were converted, if it were retail space, it would still meet the need with the use. But can I see that chart again?
Yeah. So that chart is the use of the code for these two specific uses. I would need to raise the, let me just take a quick look. So the upper right hand is specific to those uses. We have in the city code, the percentages that we would use for the different use, for the different times. If you give me a second, I will pull that up. But how this was calculated for the 7 a.m. to 6 p.m., the office use has 100% of its parking demand. So that's why you see when you move to the second column, when you're looking at the far left, you see 105.7, and then you see 105.7 in the 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. When you look at the multifamily, you see 60, but then you only see 36 in that column. That's because it only requires 60% of the residential. If let me give me 1 second to pull up the table from the code. If this was retail instead of commercial, the way the retail category happens to be, retail is 100% use at 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. on the weekend. So that would be, it happens to be office and retail have the same base use of 3 stalls per 100. So that would be 105.7 would be the parking demand. And then you see in this table, on the weekend, residential is 75%. So the weekend, 7 a.m. to 6 p.m., you see there's 45 parking need instead of 36 during the weekday. So if this was 100% retail, the parking demand would be 151. But when we look at retail during the 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. on the weekdays, it's only 90%, where office is 100. So this would be allowed to have some mix of office and retail and still not create a need over 142. But there's a point where you would get towards 100% retail, where this would not meet that parking demand. Now, just for reference, as I stated, the office and the commercial uses both have the same standard of 3 stalls per 1,000 square feet. If this was a restaurant, it would be a parking requirement of 15.2 stalls per 1,000 square feet. So 5 times higher than either an office or a retail use.
So if what they're proposing to be office service were converted to retail, and they had this joint agreement, they would still have sufficient parking. But if they converted it all to restaurants, they would not?
If they converted all the office to retail, they would be short by 9.
They'd be short, okay.
But if they converted the office, some of the office to retail, the joint parking would generate 142 or less. It's when you convert all the office to all the retail, you're short. Converting any of this office to restaurants, we would have to increase the parking demand 5-fold. We'd have to increase the parking demand from 3 stalls per 1,000 square feet to 15.2 stalls per 1,000 square feet.
Okay. And do you make is there any change in the type of retail? Is there any difference? Or what about like a small fitness facility, like a Core Power?
Right. So we've had some discussions about that. That's not allowed in the joint facilities. There is language about lists of uses that are predominantly day, predominantly evening that you can compare to, but there is different parking standards for salons than retail, fitness than retail. It would either be, we can clearly determine what type of use it is and where that use falls during the day, or they would need to supply a parking study and potentially come in and amend the conditional use permit to show that they can meet that standard, the 142.
All right. Thank you.
Question? So if this were to be approved, the residents of these buildings, or this building, would not have designated spots. So if they left during the day and came back at 2 or 3 or whatever in the afternoon, it's not guaranteed that they would have a place to park their car. Is that correct?
That is correct. The parking analysis we did through a consultant when we adopted this code shows that about 60% of the peak residential demand occurs during the day. But yeah, the 40% of the residential parking demand needs to be free during the day to accommodate the office use.
Okay.
And can that,
Go ahead.
the parking in the building, can it be restricted by the building owner to be limited only to businesses in the building?
The Chair, the code, I'm sorry, can you repeat your question?
Is it possible for the owner of the building or businesses to restrict parking for only people coming to use any of the retail or offices in that building? Or could somebody park there and go across the street? What's the
So the code requires, and this would be something that we would include in a condition, should this conditional use permit go forward, is the applicant or the landlord needs to describe, show how they make these uses accommodate this parking demand during the weekday. So signage, limitations, whatever would need to be a condition of the approval. In my staff report, I suggested that signage, that that there can't be reserved residential parking and make this mixed joint facility work.
So then it therefore can't also be reserved for anybody in the building, including office space. So,
Yes, because those would need to get freed up for the residential.
so could very well be that 142 people park there that don't live there or go to any of the retail businesses.
So this is a conditional use permit request. We could put, it's possible to create conditions that would, prohibit others that are not using this building from using that parking area. That is an advantage of having a conditional use permit over, just a permitted use.
Commissioner Schwalbe?
So this is a long parking, underground parking, goes from one end to the other. So an owner there, a residential owner, who had their condo in building number 3 may have to park all the way down to building number 6 if there was not another place to park nowhere near them, their own unit. Is that correct?
That is a plausible scenario. To make this joint facility work, a resident can't have a reserved stall. So if you live in core A3, you cannot have a reserved parking stall under A3 because they need to be available for the other uses.
Okay. And there is, of course, no surface parking. That's
Correct. No surface parking is proposed.
Commissioner Sorensen?
So just back to the question the chair had about if the possibility of parking here, but walking across the street. So you could control that kind of by signage, maybe? I mean, what would be the practical way
a
that you would control
door
that?
that, encloses this parking structure, but, there's going to be garbage vehicles, there's going to be Amazon delivery vehicles, there's going to be tenants coming to these offices, so it's hard to say everybody's going to have like a fob or a key to go in because there are people who don't normally visit this space that's going to need to be there, but it is a controlled facility. It could be if somebody's there that isn't using that establishment, maybe the landlord gets them towed. I don't see how, it would be completely by key access because the public who's visiting these businesses need to use it or visitors to the apartments have to use it, but it is controlled. It's not just an open parking lot. You do need to go through a door to get in or
Not
not.
open parking lot, but seems to be pretty open. I mean, you can drive in there, if it's office, retail, et cetera. And okay. So is a coffee shop considered restaurant in terms of parking?
Yes, it is.
So if we if down the road, this wasn't completely office, because the parking analysis is based on office, and there was a desire to incorporate some coffee shop, restaurant, retail space, how would we do that practically?
Putting the retail aside, that there's probably a way to do a mix of office and retail. Restaurants, it appears that they would need to come in and request an amendment to this CUP and show how either the other two options through the code is if there's available parking stalls within a certain area, a certain radius, they could amend this CUP, or if there are parking stalls available through the city's FILAP process, fee in lieu of parking. But I'm not aware of any excess parking stalls nearby.
Yeah.
And Emily, correct me if I'm wrong, but the parking lot public parking lot across the street is, most of those are accounted for through other approved FILAPs.
Yeah, that's correct. At this point, we've reached pretty much demand for that parking lot across the street behind Ventana and the Melvin's 235 building. I guess the third option here in this scenario would be for the applicant to eventually apply for a variance from our parking requirement for coffee shops or restaurants too. But we would need to show practical difficulty in that case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as long as we're on parking, could you bring up the lower level of core A1?
Let me go, oh, actually, there I am.
So, and maybe this is a question for the applicant, but in terms of kind of loading, unloading, deliveries, people moving in and out of their condos, semis, deliveries, how do you, what's the, I mean, do you back in here? Because
They're going to have,
how would a semi work?
they're going to have to back one of the two directions. Either they back into the parking stall, or, the parking structure, or they pull into the parking structure and then have to back out.
And you would back out on Lake Street?
Well, or you, from Lake Street, back in and then pull out onto Lake Street.
But in either way, you're stopping on Lake Street and then,
Yep.
and then that's how you would enter here with either a big, maybe a big panel truck or a semi?
That's correct.
Okay, and then Amazon deliveries?
So Amazon
that
deliveries
type
would
thing.
come in, they would use the second red area. So
Okay.
Amazon would come in, park there towards the north, and then they could back up, they could either, within the parking structure, they should be able to back up and exit facing forward.
Where would they do that?
That red circle to the upper left hand,
Okay, so that's a loading, unloading berth area, so you'd back up in that space? I see, that's what it's for?
yep, that's what that one's for.
So smaller truck deliveries could do that.
Yep.
Well, people moving in and out of condos with, big moving vans.
They would be located in that circle on the bottom center.
Then you trucked it down some way to an elevator court and go up. Okay.
That could be a long trek all the way down to A6, right?
This is located in Core A1, the farthest east
Okay.
core.
I have another question, but I don't have to. Someone else is going.
I mean, if you have a question, let's hear it.
Okay. So we're talking about almost another 40,000 square feet of commercial space. So my question is, do you know by chance how much square footage of commercial space is vacant right now in downtown Wayzata, including the promenade and everything down at the east end?
I'm going to defer that one to Community Development Director Geldner.
Okay.
We have a couple individual vacancies along Lake Street, notably across the street from this site at 201 Lake Street. There's some vacancy there, as well as the former Caribou Coffee is currently vacant. Former retail space is quite popular. That's on the 600 block of Lake Street. And then over in the Promenade area, we've had a vacancy that's been hovering around 40% for quite a while now. There's one space in there particularly. It's on what we call the Superior Block. There was a proposal for that location a number of years ago. This space is 25,000 square feet in size, and that's really the majority of the vacancy. Otherwise, the other vacancies we have are more internal to the Promenade site, and those spaces range from maybe 1,000 square feet to 7,000 square feet, give or take. So roughly, I would say the vacancy at Promenade's been around 40% for a number of years. But overall in Lake Street, I don't have a solid percentage, but has been mostly leased.
Okay, so from the city's point of view, are we looking for more commercial space in downtown Wayzata?
I would say that our comprehensive plan is looking for commercial space on the ground floor in our central business district. It's, I think, a resilient choice for us to have multiple smaller spaces available to multiple tenants so that they can come and go as times in the market change. I know just from experience with the promenade that office users or other commercial spaces are looking for a Lake Street address, so that is helpful to see here in this proposal. But I really look to the applicant to provide more information on the market long-term, but I would say it is part of our vision to have that, yes.
Thank you.
Commissioner Douglas has a question, but just for clarity, we also have a legal dispute between Anthropology and their landlord currently on, right? So they haven't paid rent or something like that, which may be an indication of the retail outlook.
I don't know if I can really speak to that specifically. I haven't really been involved. It's honestly a dispute that's between two private parties that the city hasn't been involved in. I can just say that Anthropology is the anchor tenant in that location and a really important piece of the promenade's visibility. That's really all I can speak to.
Thank you for clarifying. Commissioner Douglas?
No, most of my questions have been answered, but there are a couple more for Eric. You mentioned the average grade plane, and I'm building A1. Does the dome, which is very attractive, does that conform to the standard for height? Okay.
Yes, so that one, we would do half of the peak. So see the red line there, that's half of that
Okay.
peak.
Quick question, in the letter from Three Rivers Park District, who would follow up on those suggestions that they've made? They're not major changes, but there were suggestions that they wanted.
Should this move forward, we would include them both in the development agreement and then review them when they would come in for building permit.
Okay, and then one last thing. The ramp entrance, how does that line up now with the current east parking lot, east entrance?
Let me find the page in the staff report where you can find that. We clipped a number of these images for space here in the presentation.
It appears to be in a similar place, but I'd like some clarification on that.
So it comes in about at the property line. This would be page 105 of 203. It comes in at about at the property line of Ventana and Wayzata Blue.
Okay. And on the open space that we have, is that still up on the screen? It looks like the driveway's coming through the park, yellow.
It coming through the area in yellow, but the improvements, so it meets the definition of the little area between the drive and the building core A1 meets the definition of open space. But when we look at, this view, you see the planned improvements with those sitting areas are all located east of that drive access. The area between core A1 and the drive access is the sidewalk and a couple of trees.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions for staff?
Can you please, I'm looking at page 105 right now, and I don't see the parking garage entrance in comparison to the buildings across the street. which I thought was what we were talking about.
Yeah, it's the property lines. You can see the property lines on the north side. You'll see on the north side, there's a gray line, which happens to be the property line between Wayzata Blue and Ventana.
Okay.
Commissioner Sorensen?
Do you recall the elevation of the water table?
I don't at the moment.
Parking garage elevation is 930.31.
I know that's higher than the water table, but I'd have to look back to what it was. The issue what we pointed out in the previous application was they had mechanical parking structures that actually lowered cars.
Yeah.
It was that lowering was where it interfered with the water table.
Okay. And then Eric, on the impervious surface question, so the lot coverage complies, it's less than 75%. And then the impervious surface calculation of 84.5, whatever it was, is over 75, but can't you mitigate that though with, storm water runoff and that type of thing? I thought city engineer seemed okay with this.
There are multiple standards, which we point out on the slide after this, but one of the standards to get this approved, which is the shore impact plan, is to show how they address the stormwater. And the city engineer did review that, and it is a sufficient stormwater system for the proposed 84.5% to meet the code and other stormwater regulations. But let me just go to the next slide. That's only one standard, the address and mitigate adverse impacts from impervious surfaces. We did talk about the third one, the lot coverage. That's different than impervious surfaces. So this is still within the view of Lake Minnetonka that addressing the appearance of the buildings is the third standard. So just wanted to point that out. Addressing stormwater impacts is only one of three standards that need to be met.
But the third criteria here, less than 75%, we are less than 75%.
Lot coverage is less than 75%, yes, correct.
Okay, and probably my last question for a bit. On the open space issue, the landlord-controlled open space, I believe, applied to the plaza areas, the 25-foot view corridors.
Yep, correct.
So how should we think of landlord-controlled open space? I mean, is it?
I think
It's something you address later in a development agreement, but I think it would be important for everyone to know just how that, to have some confidence that it's truly going to function as open space almost all the time.
So within the PUD, CUP, should this move forward, we can address that as well as the developer agreement. I think the applicant is here. Maybe it's best that they address
Okay.
what they mean by landlord controlled.
Any further questions?
I just have one question.
Yep.
Most of my other questions have been asked, but as it relates to the permit for multiple family residential on the ground level, we have a couple of other buildings across Lake Street that have ground level residential. Can you just verify those buildings and what those are zoned and permit, or like, what are they zoned at? Were they CUP? Were they, how did we get to those?
So those three, the Wayzata Blue, Ventana, and Meyer Place, are all zoned PUD. This requirement that we're talking about is that in the C4A zoning district, which is a zoning district they're requesting, ground level multifamily is a conditional use. So
Got it.
the difference in zoning is how we address those developments on the north side of Lake Street.
And I think I do have one more question. So this is currently a PUD. If they were to redevelop this, can they still use the same PUD, or would they have to come back for a new PUD if they wanted to make?
The PUD was very specific for the office
Okay.
and bank use. And so, you know, even in previous applications, they were rezoning from PUD to PUD because it was going to be its own unique PUD. They're proposing to demolish the existing building and therefore would not be able to use the existing PUD for new development.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. If there's no further questions, then at this time, I think we'd like to invite the applicant to come forward and address the commission. Please state your name and address for the record and your role, if you're an advisor or other part of the team. Given the time we have and amount we need to cover, please keep your presentation as close as possible to 10 minutes. Thank you.
Kelsey Thompson, I'm the development lead at Lake West Development, located at 14525 Highway 7 in Minnetonka. I'm just going to get set up with my laptop for just a moment. All right, good evening, planning commissioners, city staff, and audience. And thank you to planning commissioner, community developer Gellner and planners Weber for your presentation. And before I introduce our development team tonight, I'd like to just pause and say thank you all for being here tonight. I think we can agree that the majority of us are here tonight because we really care about Wayzata. Wayzata is a beautiful and welcoming community that has a lot to offer. I actually first moved to the area from Paris, France, where I was living for a temporary job. And prior to that, I really hadn't had much interaction with the city. But as a newcomer, I fell in love with the walkable community, the downtown area, and the charming village. And of course, the views of Lake Minnetonka. I remember the first time I ever approached the former TCF building. Typically, I kept my walk short along Lake Street in the center of where the retail shops are, which I hope anthropology figures out their thing. And I passed the curb cut of the Boatworks building and was kind of taken by surprise by the difference in the sidewalk. I had, come from this really cute and charming area where it had a liveliness to the street, and I walked into this more like cold and dark, massive building that felt so out of character for Wayzata. As a hobby, I started teaching paddleboard yoga down at Wayzata Beach, so very familiar with the area. And over time, the big brick building did begin to grow on me. And I've always imagined what that space, if utilized, what it could be. And I think it was my passion for this property that led me to working in development. As staff mentioned, we're applying for a C4A application following code. As most of you know, we previously had submitted some different iterations of PUDs that were denied, and so we went back to the drawing board, took a step back, and had a number of discussions with staff and about how to move forward this time around, and we felt that coming up with a fully compliant plan that followed the guidance of the city's ordinance, design standards, and comprehensive plan was best. Our development team will get into more of the details on how our project enhances the views of the lake, improves the environmental factors, and promotes the health, safety, and welfare of the community. But our goal here in this approach was to work with staff to submit a really more simple and clear application that meets the code for an easier approval process. So I'm super excited about our proposal tonight that we have in front of you. And I'm really proud of our development team. They've worked really, really hard with city staff in getting this application submitted over the last 8 months. We've come up with a conforming and compliant plan. And I really feel like this brings life to this property. And I hope people like me will no longer avoid walking along the side of the sidewalk and just making it more of a pedestrian-friendly area, more lively area of Lake Street, welcoming and safe. I also think it really ties in nicely with the Panaway project, which I'm a huge fan of. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Nims from Hobbs & Black. He's our structural architect. And if you have any questions throughout the night, we do have our development team here and the owner of the property. And we hope that you recommend approval for this proposal. Thank you.
Good evening, David Nims, Hobbs & Black Architects, Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm going to be brief. Staff did a great job giving highlights to this project. We've been working really closely with them, so we appreciate all their efforts in helping us bring this to you guys tonight. I just want to touch quickly on guiding principles, Wayzata's vision, being a good steward of the lake, being a forward-thinking lakeside community, and what that means for this project, starting with environmental sustainability. As noted, we have to redevelop the site. There's unmitigated stormwater running into the Lake Minnetonka right now, a number of contaminants in that, petroleum-based, non-petroleum-based, phosphorus, which can be a huge source of algae blooms, running in uncontrolled. Redevelopment of the project, which would include needing to rezone out of the PUD that it's currently in, would give 110 gallons plus of stormwater control and mitigation and storage and filtering, controlling all that before it gets to the lake. It would also remove any contaminated soils that are on the site today from previous, long time ago, business establishments that were there. Making it walkable and pedestrian friendly. These are a series of images taken from a streetcar with a camera mounted on top of roughly 8 foot 2 inches in height, kind of strung together to give a full picture of what that would be, even from a vantage point that is well above the average human's eye. You can see in position D, where this red dot is the only place that, when reviewing this, we could see the lake currently from the sidewalk. So in making it more walkable and pedestrian friendly and connected, this development is doing a number of things. There's just 800 plus lineal feet of parking lot fronting that sidewalk, and this is replacing it with 800 plus lineal feet of active mixed-use storefronts and residential and plaza spaces. The building is divided by the 5 massing breaks creating those plazas. Each one of those plazas in every way is publicly accessible by people with all mobilities. Those plazas are going to turn into vibrant city spaces. They might be landlord controlled, but that is simply, there's no gates, as you can see in this image. There's no restriction out there other than businesses and however they're using it, and generally controlled just by having people being around and not having them be vacant spaces. And that happens, as noted, every 150 feet along this sidewalk. The businesses can flow out into them, people can come up through them, get views of the lake at every point in time. I'm being quicker than I was planning on, so bear with me if I stumble a little bit. Being multi-generational and with the greater housing diversity. As noted, we have a range of unit sizes. Some are smaller, going down to 720 square feet. Those are 1-bedroom units. I think they comprise almost 28% of the units being offered. It's really going to have an appeal to a people of a broader base of incomes, which is something that is a comprehensive plan guideline, is to try and draw that population in, a younger population that might not have the financial wherewithal of an older generation. What else do I want to say about this? We're meeting those density guidelines. There was a lot of conversation at the neighborhood meeting about too much density But as noted, we're on the low end of that density as mandated. We're meeting those R5 restrictions, and we're complying with the comp plan for the 20 to 30 units per acre. You can see on the lower level plan that we've already discussed the parking. It really exists only between core A2 and core A6. Core A1 is an access way to that parking with the loading zones occurring in that space under the directive of the comprehensive plan to locate parking as much as possible behind under buildings to not be obtrusive and be a negative aspect of the site. Being connected, healthy, engaged, and active. These are accessibility diagrams that show just how active the facades can be, the plazas can be. We've gone to great lengths to lower the floor slabs across the entire north facade to correspond to grades. As we all know, there's 12 to 13 feet of grade change as you go from east to west on this site. So those all step without impacting parking below. So all interaction can come directly in off the sidewalk. There are some buildings to the north of us, I believe, where those stairs and lifts are located on the outside of the building. So this draws people in first. And more specifically, when we talk about the massing break between core A1 and core A2, there's an independent vestibule located at the sidewalk level of core A1 that can operate outside of all business hours, that has access to a lift that will take people up to that core. So there is no restriction in access in any way to get into those plaza spaces. This was just a quick shot to show, the vehicular access. So this is the east end of the property. You can kind of see screened behind the trees that are called for in the plan where the custom door would be for access to that vehicular way. It does not interfere with the activity of the street in any way from where the building starts to where the building ends on the west side. And just a quick development comparison, when we look at the densities of some of the other developments in the area, we're below that. We're maintaining this 50% open space by comparison to some of the other units. I'm not going to read through them all in the interest of time, but then we come back to just really quick touch on massing break A1 and A2. This is a view elevated slightly across the street, showing those monumental stairs. The access door for the vestibule to the lift is through this doorway here. That can again be operated off business hours, so at any point in time and not restricted. I guess I don't really need to mention this too much. This is the view where the massing break would exist today in the plans, and you can see the railroad berm behind that. It's roughly 6 feet above the sidewalk level. And we need to create this plaza at this level to be able to provide the views per the ordinance. So we're doing what I think is the best we can do right now to get everybody up there to have that view of the lake that can't exist today. And with that, I'm just going to play a really quick video. Here's the video. And turn it over to our friends at JMAD Design. So the video was going to take you, up that flight of stairs, so you could see how that view transitions you from the sidewalk up to have that view of the lake. But unfortunately, it's not playing at the moment.
Okay, thank you. My name is Rob Hull. I'm with JMAD. We are architecture design firm based in downtown Minneapolis, 75 Market Street at the IMS building. And I'll keep my comments short, but want to just point out when we were brought into the project, our challenge was to create a building that has a lot of charm and fits into the fabric of Wayzata. And so we looked at that both from an aesthetic perspective on the exterior of the building, as well as how the building functions and interacts with the street. And a key feature of that is this rotunda element that we've seen previously that's prominently featured on that highly visible corner and invites people towards the building and invites them to carry and progress down the street as well. A couple more views of that. And then another element that we brought was the variations in the building facade. Some places it comes out towards the street, some places it's recessed and has these accented entries that really welcome people into the building with using a variety of elements that form a cohesive whole. Here's that shot looking in the plaza again towards the lake, and a little closer. And of course, we want to know what the building's going to look like half the year. Here it is in a snowstorm. And so then another key focus of our design was a really neighborhood-friendly, pedestrian-friendly, walkable space and building. And so that was accomplished by bringing the human scale to all of the entrances with the different architectural elements involved, as well as what I mentioned, those ins and outs of the building. And we've incorporated balconies on both the Lake Street side as well as the lake side of the building. And that brings people from inside the building out. And we also have the plaza, which bring people out of the building in and welcome everybody to explore and create a vibrant pedestrian life to the street. A couple more shots walking down the street to the west. And then I'll finally touch on the massing breaks, which have been brought up. These are open to the public. They provide public space, but they also capture those views of the lake that you get to see the full 180-degree view of that $1 million shot when you're towards the ends of the plazas looking out towards the lake, which has been pointed out in many cases is not currently the case. And these are all fully accessible from ramps, from walking from the sidewalk directly into the plazas, or in the one place where we have the staircase up, we provide a publicly accessible lift. And then I'll just end on this shot, which is looking from the water back towards the building. And so we didn't just focus on the Lake Street side of the building. We wanted to make it cohesive and well-designed. We have the entry monument on the one end. We have a nice conclusion to the building on the west end, and wanted to make it charming to people from their boats as well. And I will stop there.
Thank you. Commissioners, do we have any questions for the applicant? Yes, Commissioner Douglas.
There we go. In the neighborhood meeting, you addressed one of my concerns. The last application was the dark side of that street in the winter. And is it true that you are having heated sidewalks? You mentioned that in the meeting. And which sidewalks would those be?
Heated sidewalks and a snow melt system is something that's been explored. We haven't obviously designed anything yet because we haven't taken it to that level of engineering. For the parcel itself, I think there'd probably have to be some sort of unique development agreement in order to allow piping from the building to run out underneath the public, beyond the property line and into the public right-of-way under those sidewalks. So that's something we've discussed since that meeting. And I think Lake West is open to furthering those discussions if that's something that is desirable.
I know you've addressed it in some of the architecture, opening things up a little bit, but It's so nice down at the promenade for people to be able to walk all winter and
Yep.
not worry about icy sidewalks. Also, I want to thank you for the changes you've made in the architecture. I think it's a huge improvement. What is your understanding of your relationship to the railroad in this development? And how do you proceed with the railroad in your discussions?
I'm Sam Deal. I'm an attorney working with Lake West. I think that the development has been designed with the railroad and some of the physical features of that in mind. But the railroad has its own entitlements, and Attorney Schelzel could speak to that as well. So we can't disturb the railroad. The railroad has its right of way and access. But a number of the elements were designed to overcome, the berm that blocks the view and some of those other issues that are created by the presence of the railroad.
But will you, I know construction equipment takes a lot of room, because you're not allowed onto the railroad right away.
That's my understanding, yes.
Yeah.
And I think that can all be accounted for, given the separation between the railroad right-of-way and the property lines and where construction would be.
So if this were approved and you found out you were going to have issues, then what happens?
Well, I think we'd address those issues, but I don't anticipate that. I think that certainly property is developed along the railroad right-of-way regularly, and there are ways to address that to ensure that we don't disrupt the railroad, and obviously we ensure the safety of construction and obviously the residents as well.
Okay. And then in your construction, will there be pilings?
Yeah, wrong guy.
Yeah.
When we go to begin construction, we'll be looking to engage a construction manager, and they'll come to us with several solutions on how they would best go about constructing that edge that does front on that railroad right-of-way. It could be pilings. There'll probably be lots of conversations with the railroad themselves and determine what they want, obviously, since it'll be in operation while this is underway. So I can't say yes or no to that at this moment in time, but it will certainly be something that's developed.
Thank you, Commissioner Swanson.
So just a little more clear, I mean, so have you had discussions with the railroad about this project?
It's difficult to get a hold of the railroad, but we've reached out to them and will ensure that, we don't create problems for them, and obviously we work together to reach a solution that works for everybody.
I have a question on we spent a lot of time sort of talking about parking and trucks and management. Can you help us understand the intent of how to manage move-ins, move-outs, furniture deliveries, happening at the same time, and interference with Lake Street? How the management of parking will be facilitated and planned?
We can work on developing an actual plan that goes probably within the development agreement itself, but it's really just about scheduling and looking at peak times of traffic on Lake Street and making sure the larger vehicles that might need to back in or back out wouldn't be scheduled to be coming at those times, and that's something that would have to be coordinated with the tenants themselves.
So the tenants coordinate it, or is there somebody scheduling it on behalf of the tenants and offices?
I think the property manager would be scheduling it on behalf of the residences and the tenants.
So the intent is that there's a property manager coordinating so that there's not, two move-ins and Amazon and all that. Okay.
And I think it's noteworthy that there are 2 loading areas which actually aren't required. So there are only the one larger area is required, and so the additional area is just anticipating, ensuring that there's room for Amazon deliveries and turnaround of those.
And is that also for just general mail as well, daily mail deliveries?
It could be. We have not talked about daily mail deliveries to date. So obviously orchestrating how that takes place. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question about signage. It's something that we haven't I haven't seen anywhere. How will signage for the businesses, the offices be handled? Retail, if there is any? Are there design standards?
So we did account for signage at the entrances to the various business entries. And so those would be, for example, in this image here, the entry to the right side here. We always denote the entries with a covered awning, and the plan would be to incorporate signage into those awnings.
Commissioner Schwalbe?
I'm thinking about coffee shops, retail shops, and how receptive people will find that if they have to go into underground parking in order to get there. I just can't imagine somebody coming up, and we do need a coffee shop. We need more coffee shops. But somebody wanting to come in and get a cup of coffee on the way to work, to go down underneath, I'm sure there'll be signs telling you how far to drive, where it is. But I think people want, when they're going to get their cup of coffee or go into any kind of a retail store, they're more likely to want to park on it outside, that there would be an outside lot where people could park and run and get coffee or go shopping. It does concern me a little bit that there's no outside parking, surface parking.
We took our cues on the parking from the guidance in the comp plan about locating it, behind the building, out of the way, or under the building as much as possible in the development for this. And then trying to keep as much free, open, and actifiable, is that a word? Spaces for people to use at the grade level and the sidewalk level.
So do you see any issues with the types of companies that might come to you and want to be in these buildings based on the parking?
We think it's a benefit that, it's in the inclement weather in the winter that you have not a conditioned space, but a tempered space from that weather to be able to park your vehicles. I can say from other projects that we're working on in dense downtown areas right now, some near a railroad track in another municipality, the underground parking is sought after. People want it, and that's in a slightly fairer climate than you all have here in Minnesota. So I haven't seen any issues with it personally in certain developments.
Sir, the rest of the TV viewers can't see, so if you'd like to come and speak at if you're part of the team. Yeah, okay. Thanks for clarifying. Everybody.
I'm JMAD, but St. Louis
Can you
Park.
please state your name and address and affiliation with the project?
Jim McNeil, I'm with JMAD, architect. But St. Louis Park has a perfect example of underground parking. You have to go to the parking, you have to come out to the street. There's no parking off-street, and that's a very successful establishment with restaurants and everything else. So just wanted to point that out.
Thank you.
And there's still on-street parking on the street in that area, and obviously the pedestrian accessibility is important for that as well, for those that wouldn't want to park on the building.
And then one other thing, you have a fair amount of public open space here, which is good. Are you going to have any public restrooms there? Will they be available on this?
There are none
Long
currently
area.
in the plan, but I think as a condition of approval, that's something that could probably be, worked out in a development agreement to provide.
Well, I just want to say one more thing about the parking.
Some of the retail and/or restaurant or whatever uses are ultimately located there might have publicly accessible restrooms, obviously.
Okay. Go ahead.
I have a question then.
Commissioner Douglas. Miriam, I'm thinking about Commissioner Douglas right now, sorry.
Did you have questions, Commissioner Douglas? Okay.
No.
All right. So regarding the parking now, when we read through the packet, it mentioned office service And the parking studies were done in accordance with that, but now we're talking retail and restaurant, which, I mean, looking at the architecture, I think would be quite suitable for that, and it might be something desirable for some of the people in Wayzata. But, I mean, is there even the parking, I mean, looking at the parking plan, I don't think that's possible.
The city's parking standards will apply sort of regardless of the approval. And there are a number of different ways to solve potential problems that come up, as well as, gain additional information through, say, an additional traffic study or parking study. And so I think that obviously the project will have to comply with the code and can't, bundle up a number of uses that is not sufficient parking for. And so I think that it'll just depend on the uses that locate there. And there's a number of solutions to revisit the conditional use permit for the joint parking facility, or otherwise, work with city staff to address any issues that might come up.
Right, but you just have a fixed number of parking spots, right?
At this time, there are different potential solutions for that could address those issues and or provide additional spots, but ultimately, this is the plan at this time. And, we believe that the mix of uses that will ultimately locate there will be sufficient within that number, but obviously we'll just have to ensure that that occurs and we don't, sign up a bunch of uses that we can't handle the parking for.
Mm-hmm. And what does landlord-controlled open space?
It just means that it's not for a particular tenant. It's not for, there's different types of open space called for in the code. So there's open space for particular residents. So that could be accomplished by a balcony on a condo. And so the landlord controlled simply means that the landlord is responsible for upkeep, but that those areas are going to be accessible to the public and open to the public. And that's part of the plan all along.
They will be open to the public in perpetuity.
That's my understanding, yes. The plazas are the main areas that we're talking about.
Right, the plazas between the building.
And some of those areas may be used by the tenants, but they would be designed to interact with the public coming off the sidewalk and interacting with the site.
But you don't see a scenario where those areas would be closed off to the public?
No.
Okay.
Back to parking, is there a potential possibility to extend the parking garage on the west end beyond and underneath the garden plantings? And if so, what kind of additional spots might that provide?
I believe that would add to our impervious surface area, because I don't believe we can have structure underneath the ground. Also, we need to be able to get that robust stormwater management system in. We're floating right in the realms of our limitations on how much we could build out.
Thank you. Commissioner Stevenson?
Yeah, can you talk about what kind of commercial development will be going into these buildings? What do you envision? What do you envision going in?
I mean, right now, it's really professional and service offices. We were having a little sidebar about the ability to craft, even if it's a 500 square foot coffee kiosk spot, a landing zone off of one of the public plazas. I think all those types of uses have really yet to be explored and fleshed out as we work to get this kind of general plan of the mass and the scale and function of the building sorted out to the best we could to the ordinances guides and the comprehensive plan guides. So that's kind of the conversation we've had about it to date. But obviously that's a continually evolving place, and something we'll continue to work as closely as we have with staff on developing. Does that maybe answer the question?
Do you have tenants, or do you have people who are interested today?
Hi, Kurt Fretham, Lake West Development. To respond to your question about tenants, we've had a number of inquiries. We've had some medical type users. We've had a number of financial planning type or financial institutions more of an office use. We've had a lot of restaurants, but we've just been turning those away because we just didn't have the parking equation figured out. But primarily, we're seeing it as an office-type use, and I think the attraction we have over maybe some of the competing empty office spaces is we've got really great lake views, and that's probably a driving factor that's making people want to locate there, if that's helpful.
Yes, thank you.
Commissioner Marion?
I am looking at your landscape plan, which shows the footprint of the buildings and then also a footprint of the existing building. And it looks like the footprint of the existing building probably is the same size as maybe 1.5 of the cores. Is that what you would guess?
I think that's generally correct. I believe it's somewhere in the realm of 250 to 260 feet long.
Okay. So, and your buildings will cover the parking lots on both sides almost in their entirety?
Yep.
And what are the setbacks? Like, it looks like it varies. There's a little bit more of a setback in like cores 2 and 3, but maybe on the west end, there's less of a setback from Lake Street?
Yeah, it wanders, obviously, with the condition of the form of the site. So it does vary. I believe Planners Weber noted that there aren't any required setbacks per se in the C4A zoning district. So it's some, to the south, we have, a 0 lot line setback essentially to that railroad track. And obviously the east and west is a much larger setback in the north varies. So we come up to the property line and we come back from the property line.
Right. I'm just thinking about the pedestrian experience as you're walking from, in either direction. And that, all of a sudden you have one long building and it's pretty close to the sidewalk, particularly at that west end and at the very east end.
And I think that goes to some things that Rob was pointing out about the design of the architecture. It's something we don't talk about. We've only been talking about the significant massing breaks dividing the building, but there are, what was the term used? No, it's not. It's in the design guidelines for not massing breaks, but building recesses. And there's certain requirements for those building recesses to be 250 square feet minimum, 8 foot in a planar shift. So, we followed all those guidelines in the development of the architecture to try to combat exactly, what you're getting at. And one of the things I think it's interesting about the design that they've come up with, these little site walls that kind of pop out and do define the edge, but then the building wanders back. And there's steps in those areas to be able to wander up between the building and the sidewalk itself. So there's yet another mode for somebody to be traversing. And with all the little balconies littered around, we think that'll help curb all of the feeling of a wall and just keep activity in smaller enclaves as you traverse the site.
Mm-hmm. I do applaud you on the architecture. It's really nice. And then the parking garage, the loading zone is on the very east end. You got a semi, it's coming down Lake Street, it pulls into the parking garage, it parks. It walks half a mile to get down to the west end to drop off whatever load they're dropping off. And then they are leaving and they have to back out onto Lake Street, stop traffic, and then be on their way. Or, as they said, you could back in there. There's a turn to that drive. Semi-drivers drive it all the time, but what are your thoughts about this?
It's a pretty shallow pitch on the decline or the incline, however you want to look at it. It's less than 5%, so it's a walkable slope without handrail restrictions. And I'm not a semi-truck driver, but those guys do seem to be able to thread a needle. Structurally, we have some options to, if we wanted to explore it, I think make that door wider so there was less of a maneuvering space. We just have to have a larger beam that comes across and check some height clearances for larger vehicles. But we have some opportunity there to make that easier if that's a concern that people have about maneuverability.
I don't think anyone, so I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, and did you give any thought to putting another entrance into the parking garage? I mean, obviously you'd be taking away parking spaces, but is there any other negative aspect to that?
Yeah, I mean, in previous proposals, we looked at, multiple entries from both sides. It really diminishes the core, the ability to have the cores and the use. So to achieve the minimum density standards for the residential units, gets a little difficult. And then obviously the topography at that side of the west side is very severe when you're trying to get down. So the ramps become very steep in order to meet those lower level parking areas. And we did want to minimize the influence of trucks and traffic, as much as possible across traversing that.
Yeah, I
length
just thought it
of that
might be
site.
helpful because you don't have a truck backing up in either direction, either into the parking ramp and, which slows traffic on Lake Street.
Is there a way to, it seems like the main concern is backing up onto Lake Street, right, a large vehicle. So is there a way to, sort of guarantee that that doesn't happen either by having turnabouts within the building structure itself? Or is there a way to create a permeable, not often used backup area into where you currently have garden, which would ruin the garden on the east side, but, could it be designed in such a way that it's, integrated so that they could back there and then turn out?
I could see that being a very good possibility. We'd have to look at the topography that exists as it comes up to the railroad track, but I think that could be a very good option to explore. But obviously it would impact the park, but to your point, we in past projects, for fire truck access, et cetera, have put down permeable pavers that are adequate enough for fire trucks to be able to traverse so grass can still grow through. So it's something we could look at.
So there does seem to be a viable option to sort of ensure that there's not large trucks backing up onto Lake Street.
Yeah, I think I might be missing some restrictions that I'm not thinking of right now in giving you that answer, but it's something we could look at with staff on what's going on over there.
I just would add that we don't anticipate a significant amount of truck traffic. We're required to have that larger loading area, but I think that the much more common would be the Amazon deliveries, and that's why we've provided the second loading area so that the common deliveries would have extra space to move in and out.
Thank you. Commissioner Severson.
So in terms of the parking, so kind of walk me through the experience that someone will have getting into the parking garage. So if I'm a resident, I open the garage, I get in, and I just have to find a space. So then what happens? How do I get into the building? How do I get into my building? Is it secure for me as the resident? Can you talk about that? And then I have a second question about visitors.
There's a core that runs, an elevator and stair core that runs from the garage level up into each individual core, and that can be fobbed for security. And specifically in the elevators, that can also be fobbed for security, so nobody that's not supposed to be going up to the second floor can get up to the second floor.
But will it be fobbed that way? You said it can be. Will it?
Well, we
Expect that will happen.
I would expect that would happen, but we have not developed the project in that depth
Okay.
yet.
And then for a visitor or someone who is shopping or a service coming, someone who's coming in to use one of the services, what is that experience going to be like? How do they get into the parking garage, and then how do they get into their core that they're visiting?
Again, we haven't developed the sequencing, what kind of security might be out at that door. The guidelines direct us to obscure that parking as much as possible and the access to that parking as much as possible. So that kind of what is driving the door element being there. And we just haven't developed it, but that's something we'll be taking under consideration and working through.
Okay. And then of your 6 core buildings, are they each individual building just going to be commercial or residential, or will the buildings themselves be mixed use?
Well, we only have one building, so
Okay, or the 6 separate cores,
cores 5 and 6 have mixes on the same level, but the rest of the cores are divided between the outside of the common access way for the residential to come in from the street. The cores are divided horizontally from first level to the second level.
Any further questions? Commissioner Sorensen?
So, did I hear right that the garage will not be heated?
We haven't discussed supplying heat into that space to date. It wouldn't preclude us from choosing to do so, but we have not engineered the mechanical and systems for the building at this point.
So it sounds a little undetermined at this point, is that?
No, it's just a matter of course of general development of any project. If it's the goals for the owner, we could certainly have it be conditioned. We will have to do exhaust from there, so there will be mechanical systems in there, but we just haven't developed it to date, priced it out, worked with the contractors, and gone through the whole motion of determining exactly the fine-tuned points of the mechanicals.
Yeah, so it sounds pretty undetermined. So, one other question. The site itself sloped from one end to the other about, 12, 13 feet? And your approach on this structure is to keep the parking level flat from east to west, right? So, just out of curiosity, with that much slope, did you consider like sloping the parking level, therefore maybe given more flexibility to the elevation of the buildings, especially on the east end? And that was my question about the water level. Maybe I thought that was an issue, but.
Yeah. No, we're staying above the OHWL. Thank you. I always forget the term, the ordinary high water level, by several feet, which is kind of the recommendation that we've gotten from civil engineers to date. Maintaining a less hydrostatic pressure under the slab, et cetera. So we brought it down the minimal amount to try and minimize that. The elevations of the buildings really are determined by the sidewalk grades.
Yeah.
So I don't know that the parking necessarily has a ton of impact on it.
Yeah, so, but it sounds like that a determinant factor was the water table.
Yeah, staying out of it entirely. Yes, yes.
Okay. Thanks.
I think we've exhausted ourselves. Thank you to the applicant.
Thank you.
I'd like to request that we take a brief recess at this time. That's okay?
Our standard recess is 5 minutes. Is that sufficient?
I think so. All right.
We'll reconvene at 8:35 then, Chair.
Perfect. Should I hammer out? Okay, thank you. If everyone would please take their seat. Welcome back to the Monday, May 1st, 2023 meeting of the Wayzata Planning Commission. The meeting is back in order. Okay, so before we turn to our public hearing, I'd like to go back to staff and I understand we have some points of clarification.
Yes, we had 2 points of clarification that came up during the applicant Q&A. One is regarding loading area, and one is requiring, discussing an easement that's located on the eastern side of the property. So I'll let Eric Zweiber detail those.
Yes, so first of all, there was a statement about the loading. Just to clarify what's required, there are 2 different uses here. Each use requires a loading area, so there is a requirement for 2 loading areas. So there isn't any extra loading area. The code only requires that half of the loading areas be 50 feet deep. So just clarify that they're compliant with the code, but there isn't extra loading areas. The second one is that there is currently I'm going to go to what the actual easement is called on the survey, but there is a mini park easement located on the eastern portion of the property, and that easement essentially abuts the east curb line of that access. So the discussion about creating some sort of a turnaround in that area would not be compliant with the mini park easement.
Okay.
Those are the 2 updates.
Those are important and good updates. Thank you. All right. I'd like to turn to the public hearing at this time. Before I begin, I'd like to make some comments about the public hearing. It's a time for us to listen to you, our community, about the approval requests we're considering, and it is an important part of our official process that allows the public to participate. Any questions asked during the public hearing will be held until the end of the hearing and may be addressed by staff at that point. Keep in mind, the Commission's goal is to make a well-informed and grounded recommendation to the City Council about the applicant's request. To do this, we need to listen to each other and maintain decorum. Please let each person speak without interruptions from others. We want each person to feel free to speak openly and honestly without intimidation and without trying to talk over another person from the audience. We're trying to run an efficient meeting, so please consider not repeating at length something that's already been stated or said. Please voice your agreement with something please feel free to voice your agreement with something that's been previously said. We do appreciate new perspectives. We have all had the opportunity to read all the comments that were submitted prior to the meeting tonight and also more recently just before the meeting started. Members of the public will get 1 opportunity to speak at the microphone for up to 3 minutes. If you're not comfortable speaking tonight or have more comments after your opportunity, this is not the only time you can submit your comments. You can also submit them to the city prior to City Council's consideration of the application or attend that meeting. With that said, I'd like to now open the public hearing on 200 Lake Street East. Please state your name and address for the record, and let us know if you're connected to the applicant in any way.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Commissioners. My name is Kendra Lindahl with Landform Professional Services in Minneapolis, and I'm here on behalf of my clients. You have on your desktop, I believe, a letter that I submitted earlier today. I'm not going to read the letter, but I do want to highlight a couple of things. We are in opposition to this most recent proposal because the proposal, once again, fails to meet the standards in the comprehensive plan, your ordinance, and the design guidelines. While admittedly they've made some progress in terms of architecture, this is the 5th attempt, and there are so many questions that the Planning Commission, Council, and citizens raised at previous meetings that haven't been addressed. And to listen to the applicant this evening, and they just haven't thought about them, as if they haven't had time yet to have these conversations and evaluate these concerns that have been raised, I think legitimately, by members of the public and you, commissioners, at your last review. This proposal, in fact, now has more buildings than last time we looked at it, and we can pretend it's one building, but To the average person on the street, it's 6 buildings where there were 5 before. And I understand the code is interesting about building height, but as a neighbor, this is a taller building. The top of that roof line is taller than the top of the roof line on the previous building. I understand that legally it does comply, but from a public perspective, it's still a taller building. I was stunned by the language in this submittal for a developer to come through for the 5th time and then state in his application of February 10th that they have unilaterally terminated the planned unit development. I just want to be clear, and I know you commissioners know that, a landowner cannot terminate a PUD agreement. That is an agreement between the city and the developer. And so to change that PUD agreement requires a series of steps and working with the city to provide a solution. And so in my letter, I outlined a number of concerns. Many of them you've raised this evening already, commissioners. But at the end of the day, this proposal has a number of issues that fall short of the city's vision, fall short of the city's standards. It's death by 1,000 cuts, or is it 1,000,000 cuts? And at the core of it, it still just does not fit on this site. There's a lot of great pieces to this project, but it does not fit on this site. And for that reason, we ask you once again to recommend denial of this request. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to come forward this evening? Please.
My name is Bill Gleason. I live at 215 Berry Avenue South, Wayzata. And I'm actually pretty impressed with the presentation tonight. And I do know Kurt, and I think the project actually looks pretty good. I'm also impressed with the answers and the questions you've been coming up with here too. I'm in favor of it, and I think it actually is a good project for this location. I know it's one of those things that you always come in. I used to develop land quite a bit. No matter what you do, you'll always come into a planning commission and you're going to have a fight. People just plain don't want it for a lot of reasons. And I think you have to actually look for reasons to actually make this thing happen. I'm impressed with it, and it's not unusual to have people fighting it. Every project I've ever done is you always have a room full of people, and you're going to have all the reasons why they don't like it and they don't want it to be there. I think you really have to look at why it actually should work. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to come up and speak this evening? Please. Oh, we've got a tie again.
Hi, my name's Daniel Anderson. I live at 3540 Montgomery Avenue in Deep Haven. I've seen this concept a couple times. I wasn't really going to say anything tonight, but I'm a little miffed when people kind of come up and say the lines that it's death by 1,000 cuts. There's not one building in this community designed by exact city guidelines. And that's the beauty of design. As a design concept architect, I travel a lot. And what I see with this design, the separating those buildings, those are things you don't see in our community. You see them when you travel. And that's where I think the architecture speaks for itself. The pedestrian level, to have those little, you can call them alleyways, you can call them whatever you want to call them, but it creates a desire to want to be in those spaces. I can tell you that what was built on the east, I think, turned out beautiful, but there's a reason why you're 40%, not least, because you can't see it. This, you can see the whole thing, and it draws people. If you come down here on a Friday night, the time it takes you to get to that intersection where the Cove is, all right there. What does that tell you? that you guys have not thought through how to draw and spread out your pedestrians to encompass the whole downtown area. And if you think about it, you come in from the west, and there's this explosion of architecture, but we're getting so much to be exactly the same. You drive down the main drag, it's contemporary, 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 and there's a certain criteria in certain spaces some have not met, most have not met. But this pedestrian level is so neat, and it draws you down and gets you past the boat. The Boatworks facility. Otherwise, you don't go past that. It's dead down there. So you've expanded, you've brought people down there. I think this design is amazing. I love the pedestrian heights, the different peaks, but you are never going to get what do they say, a death by 1,000 cuts? That's humorous. You're never going to get it. It's never going to happen. So how do we get there? We do it through design and what draws people. And I think this does that job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, commissioners and staff. I too commend the developer for looking at the architecture and coming back with something that has a little bit of variation than what we see up and down the street. However, as a homeowner in the neighborhood, I'm very, very concerned about the parking. I don't think you can overcome it with the plan that you have, and it is not a hardship of the site, rather it's a hardship of the project. I live in the area, and I'm also a tenant in a building in the area for my business, and parking is terribly difficult, both in the residential areas and the business area. I know what will happen with the parking in this area. It won't work with the plan that we're seeing, and it will spill into the residential areas, and that will make it less charming and less residential. So I'd just like to see a little bit more work on the parking. I think we're making great improvements. I just don't think we're quite there yet. Thank you.
Oh, can you please state your name and address?
Right, sorry. Chris Planton, 196 Lakeview Lane. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good evening, Commission. Thank you for the opportunity to visit with you a moment. I'm Darren Rocha of the Rocha Legal Group. I'm here representing Bruce Lee, owner of Wayzata Bay Car Wash, 143 Lake Street East, Wayzata. Just want to identify a few key points. One of them, coming from the perspective of a business owner in that neighborhood, is there has already been a number of years of lost tax revenue as this process continues forward. I understand that that's not your primary concern, but I think it is, as a matter of public policy, something to bear in mind. And I think at this point it's measured in the millions of dollars versus this property if it were fully developed as being proposed. Also, on behalf of a local business owner, the lost revenue from the lost business over these years from the lack of development, that development will certainly bring more people to that end of downtown and would be beneficial to all of the businesses along this corridor. I would just, as an advocacy for the renaissance of this end of Lake, I would say that the businesses down there rely on the work of the council and the planning commission to find opportunities exactly like this improvement. And the role of a commission is to be and I'm not sure if it's to be constructively cautious or cautiously constructive in seeking opportunities to improve the quality of life in the city. And I would notice that, just mention that the community has had to move forward, as a previous speaker talked about, finding ways of making things work. Every building that is currently along downtown has had some impact and has had some relationship with the land that's further in, as well as with the shore. And trying to find something that's effective is a challenge, but from Mr. Lee's standpoint, this is a very good proposal. On a side note, I would just say that as I was looking at this for my client, my spouse, who is also my law partner, looked at it, and she just noted that she thought it was a very attractive look, and that she felt that kind of the eastern rotunda portion of the facility was a landmark in and of itself. And when we come in from rural Independence to the big city in downtown Wayzata, right now that is not a part of town that we would really have a great deal of interest in. I think there's a bouncy house or something down there during the festival, but otherwise there's really no reason for us to be down there. Whereas this attractive and well-lit area, certainly for my family, would improve safety and I think would be a substantial step forward for the city. So we wish you well in your deliberations, and hopefully there'll be some advancement in the development in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, good evening. My name is Ken Wilcox. I'm at 178 Westwood Lane in Wayzata. Staff, Planning Commission, first of all, let me thank the Planning Commission for the fine work that they do. As far as I'm concerned, you guys are the unsung heroes of this city, because you dig in to projects like this. You put a lot of work into it. The details that you surface are so important as it goes on to the council. You do a great job, and so my hat's off to you. As far as this project is concerned, I was pleased to see some of the architecture, the change of the design. It was friendly, it was charming, and I think an improvement. At the neighborhood meeting, one of the points I made to the developers was that they have a problem because they are building out an open space. And so the citizens are used to the open space. And so they're building on it. And in this case, unfortunately, they're building out the entire acreage there. So let me back up a minute and say and remind you, and you've heard it a couple of times tonight, that the only reason that the city has authority to do anything with ordinances is that the state gives it the power to do it to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the city. So any deliberations that you do have to be anchored in protecting or enhancing the health, safety, and welfare of the city. So this project, too, has to be evaluated in that light. Let me move on to ordinances and zoning and PUD. Now, the underlying zoning is not always the most favorable for a property. I'll give you an example, the old Locust Hills project. If that had been built under the underlying zoning, the whole property would have been covered in 1 acre lots with swimming pools. But through a PUD, we were able to cluster the homes and save a lot of the public open space and the woods and all of that. So in this case, going back to the underlying zoning opens up, comp plan opens up all kinds of flexibility that allows them to cover that entire open space with building. I think, and they haven't had a good experience with PUDs in the past, but that is, to me, the way to go. I would pull 1 or 2, they call these cores or whatever. Anyway, there's 6 buildings up there. They ought to pull 1 or 2 out, preserve more open space, because that's what's there now, and they're making that open space worse. Anytime, to me, when you have this many issues, whether it's parking, deliveries, how you handle office or retail or all of that, it suggests to me that there's too much going on this property. It's driving them to make decisions on, on trying to solve all those gremlins. So I think there's too much going on this property. I think they should go back to the drawing board, try another PUD. They certainly have learned a lot about what the city wants and expects by now. And it seems to me they could get there and leave some open space so people can see the sky. And I'm worried about the railroad too, because the apartment buildings and all down on the other end, by Ferndale, they can't open their windows in the summer because the blast of the train horns basically blow them out. And this is going to be closer than that. Plus you got vibration, and maybe they can fix all that. We also had a derailing just 2 blocks west of there about 10 years ago. And one of the rails went right through the window of the adjacent office building, and had the lady been sitting at the desk, she would have been impaled. So the railroad is an issue, and I think it's a safety issue. And is the obliteration of the open space good for the welfare of our cities, our citizens? That's your decision. But thank you for your deliberations. Thank you for being here and for the good work you do. Thank you.
Thank you. If there's no one left to speak tonight in the room, perhaps there's somebody on Zoom. Director Gellner?
I have 2 people present in the Zoom meeting, but they are not indicating a desire to speak at this time.
Okay. Well, if there's no further questions at this time, I'm going to go ahead and close the public hearing. Okay. Commissioners, do we have any further questions for the staff or applicant, or any questions that were raised from the public hearing?
Starting?
No? Okay. Well, then it's time to open up our discussion amongst commissioners as to where we are right now with this very important and significant piece of property.
Is it just amongst them, or is it?
Why do I hear voices?
We had someone unmute themselves, but they're muted now.
Okay,
So I apologize,
we're good over there.
Madam Chair. And to facilitate your deliberation, I can pull up the slides with the considerations for each request.
Perfect.
If you'd like to begin there, we could do
I
that.
think that'd be really helpful.
And I did make a printout of page 67 of your packet, which is the same set of questions that I'll pull up on the screen if it's helpful to have it on paper in front of you. And so again, this is the questions that start on page 67 of the agenda packet. It's the questions to consider for each of the requests, beginning with the rezoning request.
Thank you. Okay, well, there's a lot of things to go through, so we're going to break it down and look at these questions to consider to help structure our conversation and discussion about, the things that we've collected on our own independently and also heard this evening. I think we've all seen these questions before several times, but does anyone have any thoughts to start with where we see anything outlying or complying with what we have before us?
You want to start?
Yeah, I mean, if we can start on one end and work our way down.
Well, for starters, I was going to ask the city about the change in the zoning. And what difference does it really make to go from the PUD to the C4A? I know that the height requirement is different, 30 feet versus 35. But why else would a person ask to do that? What would be the advantages of a C4A compared to doing your own PUD?
So my understanding is that the applicant was interested in a route that did not include a PUD concept plan and general plan. And so they've requested to rezone this property to C4A. So I can't speak to all of the applicants' specific reasons. Other than that, I know that they've said that they'd like to be the C4A zoning district because that's what we've indicated is the most in alignment with the comprehensive plan if we were to choose a different zoning district than planned unit development. So, just speaking more generally, aside from what the applicant has stated, I think that they're generally we see rezoning requests for a number of different reasons from applicants. And so when we look at those requests, we need to look at all of these different findings to support a rezoning. A rezoning is a very important legislative decision of the city that guides the zoning for that property for a long period of time until it's potentially ever rezoned, if ever. So it's a really important thing that you think about tonight, and I think it's really fundamental to this application. Of course, the other parts of this application wouldn't really work without, it's all under the fundamental piece that this is rezoned to C4A. So the main difference between a C4A property and a PUD property is the height difference is different, 30 feet for C4A and 35 for a PUD. But even setting aside all of the different dimensional requirements of each district, it's important to understand that PUDs are, have a different criteria for approval, a different set of findings, essentially. It's not the same list of questions. And that's found in a different section of our ordinance. It involves a two-step process with a concept plan and a general plan. So just to summarize, I think that this applicant at this stage is not interested in the planned unit development route. They're interested in this rezoning to C4A route.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Do you, Commissioner Schwalbe, have sort of thoughts with regarding to these questions and where the actual application stands on answering them?
You mean all of them?
All of them, plus a few other sections of all of them. This, specific to zoning, so we're, or any commissioner, not to put you on the spot.
Okay.
But, in terms of, the question number one, is the proposed rezoning in compliance with the policies of the comprehensive plan? How do we feel that this is in line with that? What are your initial reactions based on everything we've heard this evening?
Well, my biggest concern is the third one down. Does the rezoning conform with all of the performance standards, and specifically parking, loading noise that seems to have come up repeatedly? And this is a beautiful building. I am sure that regardless of the size, these are going to be expensive places to live. And I think each person deserves to have their 2 parking spots if they have a unit, and therefore, I think we need to find a way for more parking. I don't know how that gets done. I kind of liked what Mr. Wilcox said about perhaps one fewer of these buildings would give us more space to come up with the parking that everybody would eventually need, especially if we do end up with something like a restaurant down there, which is not out of the question, given how much building is going on down there, that there would be a need for a restaurant or coffee shop. And that is going to automatically increase the parking needs. So the parking is an issue for me. I would need to have that worked on more.
Commissioner Sorensen?
Well, just a comment before we launch into details. I mean, this is a hugely significant project for our city. And we have about 800 linear feet of structure above grade. We've got a lot here that's almost a quarter mile long. I think it's the most significant decision we'll make on how we deal with this project since the Presbyterian Homes project. So it's, if ever a project that is deserving of a fair and diligent analysis, I think it's this one. So as far as the first request to rezone, I guess my initial thoughts on it were, it was C4A, I think, before the PUD for the existing building. The property, I think, on the north side, whatever isn't PUD is C4A. I like some of the criteria that are associated with C4A. So my initial thoughts were that it probably, at least conceptually, it made sense. Generally, it made sense. If you look at some of the criteria, I think as we talk about some of the other requests, some of the rationale of how we think about that may fall into the criteria of the rezoning request. So with that in mind, we may want to revisit approving or not approving the zoning request once we talk through some of the others, because I think some of the rationale of either approving or denying some of the request fall in line with this criteria.
So my understanding that you think that as we move down the list for the other sections, it supports or doesn't support zoning, yeah.
That'd be one of my thoughts.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, see what others think, but.
Yep. Thank you.
I agree with Commissioner Sorensen on that particular point. My main concern was also point number 3. Does it conform with all performance standards? And I was also thinking, I liked, when I first saw it, I thought C4A, great, mixed use. This is what we've been trying to achieve in the city for a long time, to be able to respond to the economy as things change. And we're in a great stage of change right now, I think, in our economy and how we do business. But I think the parking and the future use of that building is really, other uses are limited by the parking situation. And that's my biggest concern on the project. I love the new architecture. I like the walkability. There throughout this document, there were things I go, oh my gosh, I can support this, this, this. But it all goes back to that parking and the loading and the safety of that on Lake Street and I was commenting to someone, it took me 5 years to convince my friends at the promenade that there was parking in the buildings. They'd come over and they'd say, where do we park? And I said, finally, after all these years, they figured it out. They can park inside the buildings. And I think that's a key issue in this also. So it's that whole parking, loading thing that I'm really torn by.
I'm going to just keep up the line and say that, I reacted the same way with regards to the C4A initially, but without repeating everything, the parking, there does seem to be a correlation with the, number of blocks and how that impacts parking with regards to whether or not we rezone and are able to have the type of retail we need in time. And I think that's a very important consideration for the city. We always are so concerned about height, but, we have a nice height on this building, which is, historically something we spend a lot of time discussing, and we're not spending any time discussing that. So I think that's, a pro for this rezoning. But, I do echo the concern on parking. It's like, well, if the parking isn't working for the existing building, then if there's ever the need to change any of the operations or functions of the retail, we're really in a pinch for how we service that. And I didn't even think about guest parking for the building, which I think would be guests of the residents. But, I'll pass it on.
Yeah, in regard to rezoning from PUD to C4A, I kind of look at it in a different direction, and that this is a key component of whether we can recommend approval of the development project overall. Because I think it would be dangerous to rezone the property to C4A without having a project that we are in favor of. So, and I do, talking about the performance standards, that is a key issue. We've talked about the parking and that there's not enough. Were some of the uses, the commercial uses change if, you have residents that, hey, I've got a 3-bedroom unit, I want 2 parking stalls, I want to be able to leave and come back, it doesn't create a good situation for the residents that may be living there, if there's not enough parking, and there's just not enough parking in that area of town overall. And it's a beautiful, I mean, I really like the architecture. It's very inviting. It looks like it would be very suitable for, you know, something to bring vibrancy to that end of town. But it is really long. I mean, it covers, like you said, almost a quarter mile, if not a quarter mile. And it's a lot of repeat too. So even though the architecture is really good, to have one long stretch of repeat for that long of a length, I'm not sure is the best look, but I really appreciate the architect and what they've done here. So I'm kind of feeling a little bit conflicted. I feel like if they could just reduce the amount of building there, that it would reduce their need for parking, and it would solve a lot of issues. So I wouldn't recommend approval of rezoning from PUD to C4A unless, you know, a few of these changes came along, if it was tweaked a little bit to fit the area better, not so much crammed into that size of space.
When you say reduce the building, what do you mean reduce?
Take away one core or two even, you know, what's within it.
Thank you. Commissioners Sorensen? Severson?
I answered whatever. I think in terms of aesthetics, it's beautiful. I think you've done a wonderful job. I commend the developers for putting something together that really fits into the community, and I think you did a great job, and I really like it. And as I was looking through the packet, I was getting quite excited about it. I like the rotunda. I like the charm of the dormers and the lightness of the materials. So I think it is a very charming, I think, project that would fit in very nicely with our city. I think I echo some of the concerns that have been brought up. I agree, you know, the C4A rezoning probably does make sense for this project, or for this property, but I don't think under this project. And so, you know, I think had they been proposing a compliant C4A project, I would feel more comfortable moving right ahead and approving C4A. But as it is, there's so many CUPs and there's so many other things that need to be permitted and approved that are outside of the standards that I really struggle with that. And particularly on the parking, that it's not space-driven. I agree with some other commissioners that, you know, if I'm paying this much money for this unit, I would like to have my own dedicated parking. But also, I'm concerned about the safety of it, that it is open to anyone at any time. So unlike the parking structure behind the Muni or even behind Gianni's, you know, if I'm coming home with my groceries, with my children, with my grandchildren, whatever, I want to know that it's safe, and I want to know that it's, you know, not anybody is going to be in that building or in that parking structure at any time. So I think maybe a little bit more thought around how the residents and the safety of the residents coming and going would be really helpful. And you talked about having key fobs in and out of those spaces or in and out of those, you know, it's individual units. I think having a little bit more definition around how people are going to get into the buildings and how people are going to use the parking garage, I think would be very helpful. And it's a lot of buildings on the property. So I echo that same concern that it's highly dense. And whether or not it's right or not, I don't know, but for whatever reason, us residents have gotten used to a very open space there, with that building taking up a really small piece of the land and a lot of open space there. So you're going to have that, you know, be wrestling with that a little bit, I think.
Yeah.
I agree with everything that's been said. I do think this is a very attractive development. I'm less concerned about the density than many of you here. I appreciate putting, you know, dense population, using our space wisely. The masking or the massing breaks to me seem sufficient. If you're in buildings 5 and 6, you're looking at a street with houses anyway. You're not even seeing the lake. So I think the views are really nice. In terms of, you know, filling current vacant space, well, it's a vacant space, and it's not particularly attractive as is, so this would be a nice replacement of what is there. As far as the parking is concerned, you know, I'm not one to speculate or dive into hypotheticals. I can't speak for a potential buyer. Buyers may not have a problem. However, I do have that concern, and that could potentially impact the sale of the condos, the leasing of the commercial, if there are concerns about parking. And we could end up with a empty building or a lot of empty spaces in the building. So the parking is probably my major concern, that it's not very flexible and doesn't provide for future growth and saleability, frankly.
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel, I'd be more concerned about the parking with regards to, less from the resident perspective, because there's a price point for everything. However, for, you know, the visiting traffic, and also the flexibility to incorporate retail and/or restaurant or use in the future, I think we're limited. And I think that's the real problem, because there's less of a price point, I think, for retail when it comes to, you know, there's not much emotion when it comes to retail, right? But yeah, it is a beautiful building. But in this rezoning section, I think we've, you know, touched on a few points, and where we are seeing that we are struggling with the idea. Yeah, Commissioner Sorensen.
Yeah, I think it'd be appropriate to just acknowledge a lot of positive things that the developer has done since
Yes.
the application. I mean, it's clear that there's a lot of communication with the city staff, and I think they've been overall very responsive. I couldn't agree more with some of the positive comments about the architecture, the residential feel, and the tone and character. I thought, you know, maybe you got to up your pay to your charm architects, but I'd like the concept of all the parking below grade. You met the density requirements. I think the rotunda in the corner was an exceptionally good idea. It does soften that whole corner, and I think it could be, it could become a very well-known piece of architecture in our community. 2 stories, you kept with 2 stories. You met the floor area ratio, open space. So there's a whole lot about this, I think, that is very positive. I think parking is an issue that it's been hard to get comfortable with. I think parking is designed around 100% office space or close to it. And, you know, I think in our community, someone made a comment earlier about we want to draw people that into town. I think you do that more with retail and restaurants. And I think we'd have a parking challenge if that were the case.
Right.
So I think that's an issue. And then backing up trucks on Lake Street, even if it's hard to say how often it'll happen, but it seems like we need a better solution than parking and backing up large trucks on Lake Street once in a while. But if you think about those things we're struggling with on the parking issue, and you look at some of the criteria on zoning, that was my point earlier, things like possible negative effect on the area in which it's proposed, meeting performance standards and operational issues associated with parking and loading. Does it comply with the comprehensive plan? I think, you know, it goes a long way towards complying, but some of these issues are going to be a little difficult.
You know, we've talked a lot about this issue. Could we go on to some of the other things and then relate them back?
Yeah, that's a great idea.
We should move on, and then, because I think they're a lot easier to deal with, and then we can come back to this and summarize from all of them.
Yeah,
Thank you.
perfect.
Okay, thank you.
So the next section is the CUP for joint use of a parking facility, and we have 3 sort of criteria or questions to consider. We sort of covered this already pretty comprehensively, I think. So we can probably move to the next slide. We've got the conditional use permit for multiple family residential on the ground level as to whether or not it's compatible, accommodating to traffic.
I think my only concern on that one is, are they sellable? Would I want to buy a unit on the back facing the railroad? I don't know if anybody else has that question, but I mean, it's up to the developer whether they want to do that, but that would be my only question in this.
I think it's a good one.
That would be my only question as well. I see no reason not to allow ground floor residential. If they think it's viable and they can sell them, I think it would, why not?
I think it certainly would be more private than the ground floor residential that's across the street that's right on Lake Street. So I don't really have a problem with that.
Yeah. Sorensen.
So I didn't have any problem with this request also. In terms of the marketability issue of the condos or the retail, I have questions also about the marketability of both. But I think that's a private sector issue.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not taking that risk. Someone else is taking that risk.
That's right.
But I do think I would be concerned about it. But I'm okay with approving this.
Yeah, I agree. In looking at it, I think it's actually nice to have the ground floor residential. There's houses across the street that are there. I think we need more people living on that section of the street to shop at our shops. I think that the accessibility and how they've done it across feels accessible from the street, both sides. But the residential aspect, I think, is appropriate and private. Again, and I also agree with your comments on, whether or not it's near a train or how many spots there are, or, if it's private enough, are market questions that we don't have to answer. But I do think it would be, I would be in favor of having those ground units, residential.
We made the requirements, it's just that it's up to the developer if he wants to take that risk. Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Get closer to my microphone. It's up to the developer to decide if they want to take that risk, but we do meet the requirements, so.
Yeah. I think looking across those 7 items, does anyone see anything that is holding them up on that particular section? All right. Then let's move on to the Shoreline Residential Planned Unit Development Conditional Use Permit. Here we're presented with 8 items, 8 questions that we're really looking at.
The only question I had out of this whole section was number 1, the negative effect on the health, safety, and welfare. And Mr. Wilcox kind of addressed that about maybe too many cores. That would be but I mean, I wouldn't deny it just based on that.
So too many cores in terms of too many buildings, which kind of comes up with the parking as well.
Yeah.
Any other items from this list of 8 that stands out as something that we need to, to deliberate or discuss further?
I have no issues with this request.
Okay. All right, so if we don't have any further comments on whether or not the shoreline residential planned unit development conditional use permit is appropriate, then we can move on to the shoreland impact plan conditional use permit for impervious surfaces over 75%. And we've answered number 3.
And they are taking care of the stormwater runoff. They're
Yeah.
required to, I mean, so that's being solved.
It seems like we've met these requirements.
Yeah, I agree. And I do agree that the building's materials and color and all is aesthetically pleasing. The next section is significant massing break design standard deviation. Do the massing breaks provide views of Lake Minnetonka or allow potential future access to the lake? I think a lot of attention was paid to this detail, and I think that's really appreciated. In my opinion, I feel like it's an improvement to actually have a view of the lake and to bring pedestrians up to that level, and I don't really see it possible any other way. I also, having been a member of the design committee, design standards committee, appreciate the breaks and the setbacks and the detail to the design. I think it's made great improvement. I think it's very tastefully done.
The only comment I would make is it says, do the massing breaks provide views of Lake Minnetonka or allow for potential future access to the lake? And, having the stairs go up to that plaza, as long as they keep that area open to the public and, all of those plaza areas, I think then, that answers that question. But that would have to be part
In
of the
there,
agreement.
yeah, we would need assurance that it was definitely publicly accessible, and I think I like the fact that they've really thought through putting the elevator in and making that accessible. I mean, that's really great. I walk by that area every day, so I could see myself easily enjoying the lake views there that you cannot enjoy now on the sidewalk level. So I think we're probably good on this section, unless we have any further comments.
Yeah, I got comfortable with this deviation. I walked the site again recently, and it seems like the western 1/3 of the site, there's houses behind railroad tracks, and you have a very limited view of the lake. On the east side, you're below the elevation of the railroad tracks, eyeball wide, so it's hard to see the lake. So maybe the middle third, if there were more massing breaks or more attention to given to lake view in that area, but overall, I think this deviation is appropriate.
I agree with.
All right. If there's no further comment, then we can move to the last slide, parking structure setback design standard deviation.
I'm not sure I ever understood this one.
I know, this is a hard one.
Can you
Put up
please
the picture.
explain? Director Kellner or Eric?
Do you want to put up the picture?
Yes, one moment. Everyone will bring up a couple of renderings that help it visualize it better than the site plan does.
What is the deviation that it needed to be greater than 40 feet from Lake Street?
Yeah, there's 2 parts to it. Yeah, that one would be great. It needs to be, there needs to be, well, the code technically says a residential use, but that might be part, or retail use, but that might be part of the deviation if you approve that. There needs to be a commercial use 30 feet in depth along Lake Street, or along the sidewalk. And then at the ground, it needs to be 40 feet from the Lake Street right-of-way. So looking at these 2 renderings, the top rendering, kind of the third pine tree in, that's the kind of the angle of the of the building. The windows you see between those two arborvitae or pine trees, that's the entrance to the garage. That entire area is parking structure. It looks nice from the outside, but it's parking structure, it's not a use. The lower one, you know, is a different view. You see that garage door again. We're not meeting the depth of the commercial use, separating that. Every other core, and even the west third of this core, there's actually a commercial use on the ground level. There is no ground level when we look at this facade. It's a 2-story parking structure with 12 feet of commercial space in front of it.
Right. And part of that is because the land kind of curves, right? So you have a less depth to that lot.
Well, that's one issue, but also a number of the other issues brought up of, is there too much here? Because
Yes.
all the other 5 cores
Yes.
comply.
Right. So in essence, if this was set back, if there was more room on the east side of this, you'd have room for a truck to back up. You'd have, if there was less units altogether, you'd have better parking ratios potentially for multiple uses. And in addition, you may be able to meet this particular standard, although because you would be further away from that cascading sort of lot line. That's the 30 feet. And the parking, which is 40 feet from Lake Street, is highly improbable to achieve because of its being underground and the length of the lot.
Right. So
It's just an impracticality to a certain point.
Again, there's 2 standards.
Okay.
There's 30 foot of commercial uses in front of the parking structure. And then there's
Okay.
parking structure needs to be 40
Okay.
feet from Lake Street. So you got to consider both factors. You know, you may say, okay, maybe the 40 foot from Lake Street, you know, is an undue, you know, is a hardship here. But what about the activity on the sidewalk of Lake Street that you lack that 30 foot of depth of commercial use?
Yeah.
So you lack the 30-foot depth, but there are entrances in the commercial spaces at street level all the way down to that core.
Correct.
So it's not 30-foot deep, but there's entrances in the commercial spaces in that core A1, and back of that is the loading dock.
That's correct.
So
We can just show that
that's-
floor plan again,
That's why
too.
we need a variance, because it's not 30 feet deep, but it's an
Yeah.
issue of,
Just to clarify,
Loading dock there.
design standards are a deviation, which is a different standard than a variance. They are not requesting a variance. The design standards allow you to evaluate
A
a
deviation.
deviation, which is why we have different questions
Yeah.
to ask. But it's because this is only 12 feet, 11 inches instead of 30 feet that you are asked to evaluate this deviation.
yeah. And I don't know how you get around that unless the loading dock goes deeper underneath and the. and-
Or
and the
you have
commercial
less
goes above
intensity
it.
on the site, because this only exists
Yeah.
in
and
the
that-
east
Right. and that's
two-thirds
the A1.
of core A1.
Do you know how far the existing entry loading dock door is from the street now? Is it less than 40 feet?
There's a 3-foot sidewalk easement. Well, let me go to the exact sheet. On the engineering plans at the beginning of the packet has the setbacks from the property line.
That helps. I think that's probably the most attractive of the buildings. No, I don't either.
Yeah, Eric, I guess it's not that important to me. If you find it later, that's fine, but more of a curiosity question on the 40-foot dimension on the existing building.
Okay, I found it. It's 4.9 feet from the property line to the building. So add that on, you know, it's roughly 13 now, you add 5, you know, we're talking 18 feet from the right-of-way and the parking structure.
For the existing TCF building?
Oh, no, sorry, I thought you were asking here.
That was, sorry, but maybe I didn't state that well, but that was my question. But either way, I mean, we can.
That underground garage that you enter now isn't that far from.
No, I thought it was less than 40 feet.
Yeah.
Now, again, if you're under the ground level, that's fine. There is no ground level here. We have a 2-story parking structure, as is shown in that element. So if this was completely underground and you had a ground level, we wouldn't be requesting this deviation. So the TCF has a ground level.
Sure.
And then parking underneath. That's compliant.
Could you just answer questions 2 and 3? Yes or no?
Of the questions for this deviation?
Yes.
Are you asking staff's opinion of question 2 or 3?
Well, it's either a yes or no. It's 30 feet or 80% of the retail space to a depth of 30. Is it 80 feet or isn't it? I mean, 80%. We should know by the design, right?
Right. Correct. It is not, you know, that's what we're talking about, but then it's look on, by granting this deviation, this would be number 4. In granting this deviation, are we providing greater conformity with the other standards? Number 5, in granting this deviation, are we alleviating some undue burden that exists on the property? Number 6, does this deviation have a positive effect on the area?
In Chair, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Chair, just to be clear on the standard that you should be thinking about for deviations, it's really a balancing test. Right? They don't have to meet every one of these criteria like you do with some other requests. You look at the negative effect of the deviation, and you try to determine whether it's outweighed by one or more of positive factors. So Eric has pointed out several of the things that could be positive factors that would outweigh the negative effects. So you kind of have to look at, okay, how serious is the deviation? What kind of negative effects are there? And are those outweighed by something positive? I don't know if that helps when you're looking at these. But.
Yeah.
I'm glad you said that because I think this is the most attractive building of the 6 cores. But we need these deviations, but yet architecturally, I love the look of the building, so that kind of balances out for me.
Yeah. And I feel the same way. I think this building, this particular unit is unique and kind of adds something different to the whole overall look of the building. And it does all the things the designer said it did, which is kind of brings you in as a person. It kind of has a sweeping effect. And the parking underground, I think, is great. There's obviously all these concerns about the parking in terms of accessing retail, but overall, just as a fundamental thing and keeping the cars underground, I think that's ideal.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
Number 2 talks about usage, and it says retail usage. Is the ground floor facade occupied by at least 80% retail? Are we including office in that retail, or is this something that we need to discuss further?
So we've discussed this as staff. I think this is inconsistent with our other language about usage in downtown. This probably should read like the C4A, where it's retail or service commercial. It currently is not included in there.
Okay.
granting this deviation can resolve that, that you could allow it to be a service commercial instead of a retail, but this is inconsistent with our other downtown language, that it should be retail and service commercial.
Well, I just have concerns about the parking structure overall, and looking at that driveway creates concerns in and of itself for, semis getting in there, so the parking structure is a huge part of this project, and it has to work for the project to work. So,
Yeah, it's interrelated, so I think if we felt better about the parking in general and the backing up, then the deviation wouldn't be a problem,
I
potentially.
think we need to solve the parking issue.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we're hung up on that.
So we're back to that.
So we're back,
Yeah.
we're parked at parking. So in terms of the design standard deviation itself, it sounds like what we're saying is, we don't mind the deviation, but because there's a concern over why about the parking itself, that it's commingled in a sense. So that if the former were solved, then the deviation would be okay, but it's not solved on the parking. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. You're looking at me a little confused.
No. Oh, you are?
Did you have a further?
No, you.
Did you have further thought on that?
No, I don't.
No?
No, I agree.
No, I mean, I'm okay with the deviation
Yeah.
of the last one. I think parking is the issue, and we'll deal with that
Right,
in that request for the CUP.
right. Okay.
You can go back to the rezoning if you'd like, Chair, if that's a helpful place to go back to.
Yeah, well, in looking at these different sort of sections, it seems like with the exception of the last one, where if there were certain other elements solved and less commingled, we'd be okay with, I think, with the deviations. So that all seems fine, but we had noted several concerns over rezoning from PUD to C4A, even though I'm so happy with the height and look and style and feel of the building. And the parking, those two areas. So how, may I ask guidance for how we would best represent making a motion where we feel that there's, some things are good and some things we have further thoughts on?
So recognizing that there's some concern over being able to make findings of approval for the first two, the rezoning and the conditional use permit for joint use of parking. Without approval of those two items, the other items, that doesn't really allow the developer to move forward with the project. So they're a bit impractical to provide approvals for those other requests, because it's so contingent on those
Because it's a whole,
two.
it's an all-in-one.
So that's one interpretation. Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, Chair, I'd agree with Director Gellner that those, particularly the first request is pivotal. But I think because you are a body that advises council ultimately on a decision, I think your report and recommendation can reflect a lot of the positive things you've said on some of the requests, even if the ultimate recommendation is to deny because they fail to meet, for example, parking, which falls into several of these as a significant factor. So, in other words, I think you could direct staff to prepare a kind of report that would be nuanced, or at least complex in that sense. You could make a recommendation, but also find that certain criteria have been met, but something that is essential hasn't.
Right. Yeah, so based on what we're seeing, it looks like a recommendation for denial. However, we could highlight the, where that was isolated to in our findings.
Yes, I think that it'd be very important for staff as we prepare this report that particularly you highlight the major concerns so that we can make sure that we make the appropriate findings. Council, it's up to the chair whether she wants to recognize you at this time.
I think we're going to stick to where we are with the deliberations. Thank you. Should we just highlight then exactly the numbers or the exact, I know Ken has maybe taken some notes over there. I see a lot of pink highlighter. But for me, if we want to just call out, I think it'd be really helpful to call out the numbers that we're highlighting that don't comply for rezoning and for conditional use permit for joint use of a parking facility. And then note that we are, would be in approval for the remaining criteria. I don't know how to word that.
I can just add a little detail to that.
Yeah.
From my notes, I heard from the rezoning that the criteria 2, 3, and 4, there was question about whether those criteria
Yeah, that's
were
what I
met.
have.
2, 3, and 4 from the rezoning. From the conditional use permit for the joint use of a parking facility, I was hearing concern for both 1 and 2. And then I just lastly would note that there was an important potential condition of approval that came up with the massing breaks. And that was a condition that all the plazas, all the massing breaks that service plazas, be open to the public with elevator access. That I was hearing the group say that felt fundamental to the plan for the massing breaks.
I don't think it was, they would all have elevator access, was it?
No, not all have elevator
Just the one with the
access.
stairs.
Oh, just the one, okay.
Yeah, the one with stairs, but
Okay.
the important piece being that perpetual open, to the
Right,
public. So
yeah.
some form of an easement would be a recommendation to council.
Okay. Well, I guess we can,
Could I extend my comment, our comments? Besides the fact that it doesn't provide adequate parking for the scope of the project, the number of buildings and all that the buildings encompass, I also feel like it's, how do I describe it? Too many buildings from an aesthetic point of view, and the pedestrian experience walking along there. It would be nice to have more open spaces, not just the plazas, but more open space. There's, right now you have, the size building that's there is 1.5 of these cores. That's the size of it. And to have 6 of those all along that stretch at 30 feet in height is going to feel like a canyon
yeah.
in that area. So, my thought would be if we could remove 1 or 2 of the cores, I agree with that thinking. So it's more than just the parking.
Yeah, I mean, if some way we can have the notes reflect that, we think that in considering the overall number of units and how that impacts the parking and then ultimately potentially the access from delivery and semi-trucks and things of that nature. It seems to be all locked together.
Right.
Yeah.
So I would just say, one way to deal with this parking issue would be with the quantity of building and structure
Yeah.
that you build, because then you'd have more parking capacity if you kept the parking the same, but less structure above. You'd have more capacity for multi-use for the commercial space, be it retail or.
So we would want that noted under the CUP for joint use of parking facility, I guess, because that's where it would be most impactful.
Chair, I think if all commissioners agree, the idea of the proposed use's effect on the area, that's a criteria for rezoning. It's also a criteria for the CUPs too. So if that's a consensus in the motion, we'll work it into those pieces.
I think that sounds like a consensus from everybody's on that point. Can we make a motion then on?
Yes, again, I would just make sure that when you make a motion, that these are noted in the motion,
Okay.
not just a vague reference earlier, and I think Director Gellner can probably read what those findings might be for whoever makes the motion, if that would be helpful, Chair.
Yeah. I think we're ready as a group. We're just struggling literally with making sure we get it right in the actual motion, because it's complex. So,
And Chair, I'd also say procedurally, you'd be directing staff to prepare a draft planning report and recommendation that will come back to you for review and final approval at the next meeting. So between now and then, staff will work hard to get it right, but you as commissioners will want to review that report and recommendation on your consent agenda at the next meeting. And if you think we missed anything or we didn't get it right, you can revise a planning report and recommendation. We've done that before. We don't often have to do it, thankfully, but if you see, oh, we missed an important finding, and the majority at that meeting agrees, then we can amend that report and recommendation before it goes on to council. And again, as you've said, Chair, council is the final decision maker here. You're just making a recommendation, so council will take that recommendation and your findings under advisement.
okay. So then, shall I make a motion myself? I'd like to make a motion to direct staff to prepare a draft report and recommendation for adoption at the next meeting, recommending denial, but to include the findings and conditions that we've outlined for rezoning from PUD to C4A, specific to points of points 2, 3, 4, and 5. And the notes, can you, Director Gellner, highlight the specifics that we pulled?
Yeah, so Chair, the rezoning criteria listed on page 67 of the agenda packet lists number 2, 3, and 4 were part of the discussion, were findings for denial.
Not 5, yeah, because it's traffic. Yeah, we're fine with 5.
I can keep going with the
Yes,
other
please.
denial was recommendation of denial for the conditional use permit for joint use of a parking facility, referencing page 67 of the agenda packet. Questions to consider were number 1 and 2. Findings for denial to support that. And then Chair, I can move to the next one. I was hearing a motion, your motion would include approval findings for all of the other requests listed. With a recommended condition on the massing break deviation request. And then that's listed on page 68 that we're referencing, that all plazas would be open to the public in a form acceptable to the city attorney, with elevator access provided where applicable.
Correct. That's the motion. Do I have to repeat
Just,
that?
I don't think so, Chair, just that would be for your review and adoption at the next
Yeah.
Planning Commission meeting, would be to finish up the motion.
Okay. That's to finish up the motion, then. I can't even repeat that. Can I get a commissioner to
Make that motion.
make that motion?
I second Schwalbe.
Thank you.
You'd be making it, Commissioner Schwelbe, so we need, did you make it, Chair? Did you make that motion?
Yeah, I was making it, so I'm
Pardon me, I
first.
stand corrected,
Yes.
so it's been first and seconded. Further discussion?
Yes, and seconded by Commissioner Schwalbe. Thank you. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Oh, actually, should I take a roll call vote on this one potentially? Director
Schwalbe,
Gellner,
aye.
sorry, Director Gellner, would you please take a roll call vote?
Yes, Commissioner Schwalbe.
Aye.
Commissioner Sorensen.
Aye.
Commissioner Douglas.
Aye.
Chair Stockton.
Aye.
Commissioner Merriam.
Aye.
Commissioner Severson.
Aye.
Commissioner Elk.
Aye.
Okay, the ayes have it, and the motion passes. The draft report and recommendation will be on the consent agenda at our next meeting, and after adoption, will go on to City Council for their consideration. Thank you to the applicant, staff, and members of the public for preparation and participating in tonight's meeting. Okay. Next, I'd like to move on to any other items on this evening's agenda. We got
Yes,
other
Chair,
items,
I can
yes.
kind of combine the final 3 items into one.
Thank
Just
you.
a quick update. So our next meeting will occur on Monday, May 15th. We may want to ask people to clear the room here, just so I can hear.
Can I ask if you're leaving to please continue to do so?
And quietly.
Okay. Our next meeting is on Monday, May 15th. We don't have any public hearings set for May 15th. However, we do have an important item for our consent agenda. So even though it'll be a very short meeting, I would like to have it. The application we just reviewed has a 120-day deadline that occurs right around July 4th, meaning our June meetings are very important for the council. So therefore, I would like to have a meeting on May 15th, but it would be a consent agenda only. So I don't normally like to do that, but when I have time-sensitive applications, I do. Our next public hearings will then occur on the first meeting in June 5th. And then just note that there is no meeting on July 3rd. We just proactively canceled that, knowing that people would likely be out of town. Otherwise, the schedule looks pretty typical for the summer. And I don't have any specific public hearings to tell you about at this time. They're not really complete applications yet. So that's all the news I have.
Perfect. I think we can move on to adjournment then. Okay, so thank you, everyone. That
I
concludes.
will make a motion to adjourn.
Oh, wow, that concludes our meeting. We've seconded and versed it, and I'm going to vote on that. Any further discussion?
No.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The motion passes, and the May 1st, 2023 Wayzata Planning Commission meeting is now adjourned.